no bondo yun den rab nyan do ken dola nyin zen to choju jeng ken tin jing abe ze jam den sha je sing ge cha za lo nam ga da shin chen den ma me sha ra se bo le dang se me nga yun den jang zo ra za to jen zen zo me cha ne da ge ji wo sha je gen ri ji je ben song do je rong ju to ko nga je lo ben zo Pekam Jong Wenga Niji Garden, Ujian Sanji Niverso, the Namda Kunjar Ribashi, Tunzen Japan Popular Abroa, Jimmy the Longos and Do, Yonzo Jensen Lasso, the Labson and the Montage, the Mess, and the Longonjo Najish. Kalden Gujamin Zengagiwan, Jabal Janto Shablaso, the Namda Malas of Membale, Bemeto, the Lamai, chosen Regis of Janaba, number Jive Power so the Regan Chabda, Bemi Jetap was a Dojin Bergosote. Na jo wanju hero kabe jo jian gu za wanje zo na jo la ma nyam me san je rinpoche de zum de she se je tam ji ji ko song to je rang xin chen la ba ka din chen be sha la so wa de cha zo wa de ju ji sha ba dan je su ye rang ku yin so wa yo wa ju se da ge je sa ba dam je da ge chen je chen bo ro ngo ji da ngo ji de je je chen ju de ne je ba dan je se be la ba la de da ram shin de ba da de chen do la ben den do chen ju se ne ji ji xin de chen do ne la ba la ro ba yin do la ba ji Chanchuzim Jaraboje, Majabanam Jiji, Jabanyam Bamabadam, Kondo Pavasho, Nezunde Koa Matawa, Javanam Jetale Wanjute, Tamendo Yande Jirgup. Semni Chanchun number JJ, do Semni Chanchun number JJ, do Semni Chanchun number JJ, do. So, very good morning, everyone. And let me begin by expressing great happiness to be able to be here in this wonderful place. It's been, I think, a couple of years that I have, I seem to be on your mailing list, so I receive a lot of the flyers of the programs, as well as I've seen beautiful pictures since the conception of this place. And of course that it has the blessings of His Holiness Jetsun Rinpoche and Garchen Rinpoche, two of the most exceptional enlightened beings who are turning the wheel of Dharma for the benefit of so many beings, and especially in this country. And I have also met many wonderful Sangha members since I arrived here yesterday, and it's always a bonus pleasure for me to meet two of my friends, Kemola here and Anila Tenzin, with whom we've had some very exciting adventures in life together. So it's a great pleasure to be with all of you and be also able to meet some of the Sangha members here and friends that I have known now for some years, and to be able to be here for the next 2 days. And that's a wonderful opportunity for me. Oftentimes when I travel a little bit far away, but this time it seems I just came from down the road somewhere here. So that's, I think, very excellent. So I'd like to begin by thanking everyone who's made it possible for all of us to be together these next 2 days. So without wasting much time, since we have this huge topic, Lojong, to go through, and of course anyone and many of you have already studied this marvelous text. And so it doesn't require for me to say much other than that it could be taught, I think, in an abbreviated way, as often it is possible. But to study this exceptional Mahayana teaching and to try and complete it within 4 talks is, I think, going to be not a very possible thing, at least for me. So I will just go through it and then see how far we get, and then the remaining section I think we can just do a chilung or just read through it. So it's probably, as I said, one of the wonderful things is this text, because it has such a profound and important place in our practice path, that many of the Lotsawas, the translators who have today translated this in not only English but many, many different languages, make the teachings very accessible. And of course, many teachers teach it, so it is not of a great concern to me whether I'm able to finish the text or not. So I think the approach I would like to take is to go through it sequentially, so that it can, for especially the new ones who are relating to the text, create some kind of an introduction to what is the Lojong teachings or the mind training teachings. So the teachings of Lojong, the Tibetan word lo and jong, comprises and is translated, can be translated as mind taming or mind training. Lo is mind and jong is to train it or to tame it. And what do we mean by taming it or training it is not to be seen as if mind being some kind of a beast and then you have to harness it or tame it in that kind of a way. But the approach should be understood as a very gentle approach, a gentle approach in which you make the mind, your own mind, flexible, make it truly more and more aware of its innate positive qualities, constructive and good qualities. It is not about taking the mind to becoming Buddhist. It's not about taking the mind to learn something new. It's not about taming and trying to make it tamed by acquisition of something that is external. But taming the mind, Lojong has to be understood as an inward introspection, turning inward, allowing the mind to recall what it has forgotten as its own capacity, to be able to look inward and discover what its own natural nature is, forgotten by different kinds of habitual patterns, habitual tendencies that we have, in which responding to such a habitual pattern, which makes us almost sort of feel that for everything good to arise, we have to turn external of our own selves, outside of our own selves, whereas the power of anything good is intrinsic, is inherent. So Lojong is discovering the natural propensity, discovering the natural nature, discovering what is an innate quality, inherent and intrinsic of each one of us, and then being able to not only discover that, but there are 3 steps. One is introduction, introducing yourself to your own inner mind and its true good qualities, natural, inherent, basic good qualities. First is introduction. Second is familiarity, not only introducing yourself to it, which is not so difficult because that's your innate nature. So therefore introducing yourself is sort of maybe something that you need to depend on a teacher or a teaching to do so, but innately, because it's your own nature, introduction is far more easier than the second one, which is gaining familiarity. So not only introducing yourself to your own mind's basic goodness, but gaining familiarity with it. That's quite difficult because that really requires the training to then come about. And the Jongwa, the training is about gaining familiarity. And perhaps even more difficult than that is the third step, which is irreversible or indestructible confidence of your own nature. So these are the 3 steps. When you introduce yourself to your own mind's profoundly good qualities that are natural, not only introducing yourself but gaining familiarity, that's what path of Buddhism comes about. So whenever you say something like, I am a Buddhist, what we mean by that is you're practicing. And what we mean by practicing, and people keep it very abstract by saying, I meditate. But you never know what a meditator is meditating on. So we have to be a little bit skeptic about that. So now, if truly you understand what meditation means, then it is what the Tibetan word is, gom, which is familiarity. So meditation is perhaps even better understood when you give in your own mind that every time you say, I'm meditating, what you're precisely doing is you're familiarizing yourself. You're allowing yourself to becoming familiar with that what you have introduced yourself to. So if it's a good quality, a innate, natural quality that truly is the basis of happiness for yourself and the others, giving yourself momentum to practice uninterruptedly, to gain familiarity, that is then what would be meditation. So path, meditation becomes familiarity. This is then very important, and that which then only builds up to its fruitioning state of confidence, that you are not separate. You're so familiar with what your basic nature is that you're very uninterruptedly, indestructibly confident of your own nature. And like the great bodhisattvas and the great masters, how do we separate enlightened beings and bodhisattvas from ordinary sentient beings? Is just this, is that for many of us in the beginning stages, we haven't even introduced ourselves to our own mind. Then some of us may have introduced, but we're still in the process of gaining familiarity, and then hopefully gain the confidence that is unshakable. Whereas that is then the sentient beings. Whereas the bodhisattvas are those who have not only introduced, but have gained familiarity and remain in that unshaken, indestructible confidence, and that is what then we refer as bodhisattvas and the Buddhas and the great enlightened beings. So Jongwa, training the mind, should be understood as this process of introducing, of gaining familiarity, and then developing the irreversible confidence. And that then would lead to the cultivation of the mind's innate quality known as bodhichitta, the enlightened awareness or the altruistic compassion, whichever terms we may use, and we will get to that later. So the bodhichitta, the awakened heart of basic goodness, that which is your own nature, introducing yourself to it, meditating to gaining familiarity, and then ultimately being so confident that you are able to remain within that awakened mind, even in the post-meditation stages. The summarization of what the Lojong teachings are can be then kept as simple as that. So now, people of the highest potential and acumen and those who have sort of studied and worked with your mind, we can basically end the talk after this summarization. So this is what is Lojong. So then, if we are to elaborate on that and to give a little bit more detail on this, then the main teaching, teachings, and there are various versions of the teachings. I'm going to relate to Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Thay's, the previous Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Thay's commentary on the mind training. So that's the book, and if you have that book, you can refer to it. According to the detailed commentary of Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Thay, Lojong teachings basically are divided first into three classifications. Studying the source of the teaching, which is usually an important section, is that you begin to learn the lineage and how the teachings evolved and began, the history of the teachings, how it evolved. That then gives you a sense of connection to being followers of the lineage, to belong to that lineage, to connect to that lineage. And that brings a sense of aliveness to the teachings and the practices. So that's the first section. Second classification is direction of the teachings, or what is known as stating the vision of the teachings. Second classification allows us to understand how to relate to the Lojong teachings. What is the vision? To say, I am practicing Lojong, what does it really mean? If that vision of the practice itself is not clear, then it can again sometimes lead to a certain abstract relationship to the practices where you know what you are doing and you know it is important or it is beneficial, but you can't quite grasp the quintessence of the teachings. So the second classification helps us to really understand the vision of the view and the practice of the Lojong teachings. And then the third classification is the detailed exposition or the instructions of the main teachings. So the first classification being the source of the teachings, and as many of us who study the Mahayana teachings of Lojong know, the connection to the teachings, of course, inevitably meets with the Buddha's teachings. So the Buddha's transmissions and the teachings of the three yanas, the Hinayana, the Sutrayana, the Mahayana teachings, and then the Vajrayana teachings, And these teachings are then related to the Buddha's second turning of the wheel of the Dharma, which is the basis of all of the Mahayana teachings. But from the Buddha then transmitting to many of the bodhisattvas of the great many different teachings that go especially through Arya Manjushri, Arya Avalokiteshvara, Arya Maitreya, and so forth. But in connection to the very core of what is today known as Lojong teachings, we then find the reference as these teachings originating in the form that we have today from the great master Atisha. And so Atisha Dibamkara, as he is known, one of the greatest masters of the 10th century, 982 is his year of the birth. And so this 10th century great master, his biography is quite similar to the Buddha's life history in that he was also born into a princely family, and he was encouraged to follow the path of his own father and to take over the governance of the, I think it is called a kingdom, but during the time that we speak about, the kingdoms were relatively princely states, and therefore he was also expected to take on the governance of that kingdom or the princely state. But from a very young age, Atisha had a very close relationship with Aryatara. Last night when I came here around the dining table, Jeremy and Kwang and some of the members were telling me about how this place came into being and how Jebje Garchen Rinpoche had asked you all to meditate and supplicate to Tara to be able to then get this place. And I thought that is wonderful, that there's this relationship between the vision of Tara and the blessings of the Tara. So likewise, Atisha, from a very young age, is said to have had dreams and indications and visions of Tara encouraging him to turn towards Dharma. And because Buddhism was very, very well established during that time, and the Nalanda University was very well known, Atisha is said to have then followed his heart as well as his wish to study the Dharma, and he left his family and all of his responsibilities and took up ordination and stayed in Nalanda, studied in the Nalanda, great University of Nalanda. He is said to have received many, many teachings from great many teachers. Now, if I call out all the names, Jatari, Bodhipada, especially Avadutipada, Vidya Kokila, Rahula Gupta, at least for the translators, these might be a lot of many different names. So we can just keep it many teachers. He had many teachers. And he joined the Nalanda University at the age of 29. And his name, Dipamkara Srijana, was the name that he received at ordination. He studied, practiced, became a great learned scholar, and eventually he also became the chief abbot of the same university, Nalanda. During the course of his being the chief abbot, he is said to have gone circumambulating the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And in that place, and if you've been to Bodh Gaya, many of you will have noticed that on the left-hand side of the main entrance, there is the Tara shrine, where there is the self-arisen Tara in the rock that is there. It is there that the Tara is said to have manifested to Atisha. And Atisha is said to have been delighted to coming face to face with Tara. And he asked the question, he supplicated to Tara, and he asked the simple question, what is the most important practice for enlightenment? And Tara is said to have then told him, there is nothing that is not more profound and essential than the practice of bodhichitta. So therefore, she said, single-mindedly seeking to realize innate, selfless compassion, bodhichitta, is that what holds the essence of all the views, all the paths, all the meditations. And so inspired by this, Atisha is said to have, despite everything else that he learned and knew, he is said to have then directed his focus in just learning how to cultivate compassion and bodhichitta. And it is in that moment that he then began to look for who would be the teacher, the most essential teacher, the most realized master from whom he could study. And it was then given to him to go to Serlingpa, the great master Serlingpa, who had worked his entire life in teaching and practicing bodhicitta. But Serlingpa lived in Sumatra, Indonesia at that time. And so through many different arduous months, it is I think 13 months of arduous journey from India to Indonesia at that time, Atisha left, and for 12 years he sat at the feet of Serlingpa to receive teachings, and then returned. After that, became the abbot of Vikramashila, and began to then teach the teachings on generation of compassion, the bodhicitta, cultivating the heart of bodhicitta. And Atisha became very renowned, and this was then during the time where Tibet was just beginning to become very strong base with the teachings of the Buddha, especially the Mahayana and the Vajrayana teachings. And it became very much the wish of all the kings and the practitioners of Tibet to receive teachings on how to cultivate bodhicitta, how to receive the Mahayana teachings. And they began to look at who would be the supreme master who could be invited to teach on this subject. And everybody then really began to have the aspiration of inviting Atisha to Tibet to propound and teach the teachings. Many attempts were made. I think I've heard almost over 50 attempts of different groups going to Atisha and requesting him to come. Especially the group that is very well known was the group led by Yeshe, one of the great practitioners. Along with 21 monks he's said to have traveled from Tibet, only 2 survived the journey. And among them, Yeshe was the main one. Atisha refused, he went back, and then he again got the support and the request, and he made another attempt to come again back to invite Atisha, thinking that if he really went with a lot of offerings, maybe that will change the mind of Atisha. So he began to collect enough gold that would be equal to the weight, his own weight. And so he had a lot of benefactors, it is said, who gave him a lot of money or gold or whatever it was, and he had enough, just as much. And now the anecdote goes and says he had enough that would weigh as much as his body except his head. So whatever that meant, I don't know how heavy the head would be, but that is what is written in the teachings. It is at that time that he was preparing when he was captured by some of the Khan invaders at that time. And he was captured and kidnapped, and the condition was that if he gave them the gold that he had been collecting to offer to Atisha and invite, they would release him. So they sent a ransom note to his nephew, Changchuhui, saying, if that gold that you have kept for taking to India is given to us, we will release your uncle Yeshe. And so Changchuhui, his nephew, tried to collect all the gold and give, but he went to get the permission from his uncle, and Yeshe refused, saying, my life is not as important as it is for you to invite this great master to come and receive the teachings. And so Yeshe never escaped the prison, but Changchuhui then took the advice of his uncle, and he took the gold and he traveled to India, and he placed it at the feet of Atisha, saying, telling him the story of how it was. And Atisha was very, very touched at the earnestness. And, in some ways you have to think about how much they valued the instructions and the teachings. And I think this is really missing in today's times, where teachings are very, very accessible. And there's a good side to it, that it is very accessible, it should be accessible. But on the other hand, when it is too accessible, then I don't think we would be as courageous as this great master Yeshe. However, Atisha was very, very touched when he heard that someone had, 21 people had tried to come, and then so many had lost their lives. But that knowingly Yeshe had given up his life to invite him. And so that is when Atisha, then after many, many requests, agreed to come to Tibet. And that is how these teachings of Atisha survived, because Nalanda was destroyed after that time. And so these teachings with Atisha, he came to Tibet, he taught. And Atisha again stayed in Tibet for almost 17 years, teaching the teachings. Tibetans were rough. We are still rough, but at that time we were said to be even more rough. And so Atisha taught the bodhichitta teachings for 17 years, but it never really got on as being so well received, because it takes time to tame minds. It's not something that is doable within a short period of time, even when great bodhisattvas manifest and teach. And of course, many, many excellent practitioners evolved at that time. And so Kungo Dromsum, Atisha's main 3 disciples, continued the lineage of these Lojong teachings. However, they did not really flourish through the 10 directions very, very strongly until the time of Chekawa, Geshe Chekawa. Geshe Chekawa, another great student of the Mahayana Buddhism at that time, is said to have been meditating in one of the rooms. And it so happened that the room that was given to him, because he had not applied to do the retreat earlier on, so he was only able to receive a very smaller room that had even not much of a window and clean air coming in. But he was sitting in there meditating, and since it was a very bare room, his eyes moved to the wall. And then there, scratched on the wall, he read a small slogan which said, "Gain and victory to the others, loss to one's own self." And so staring at that slogan, he was very struck at how pithy it was. Loss and defeat to one's own self, gain and victory to the others. And he thought, in just a simple 2 lines, the pith of so much of training of one's own mind is there. Because so oftentimes, Chekawa thought, we say a lot, and sometimes when you say a lot, the gist or the essence gets lost. But if there is a pith of a slogan that's to the point, points to the mind, awakens your mind to its own capacity, and truly embodies the whole Mahayana view within it, how profoundly impactful he felt. And he felt that this kind of a teaching was what he really was looking for. So he left the retreat and set out to look for who had scratched this on the wall. And then he found out that Geshe Langri Thangpa, another great master of Tibet, had then written this on the wall. Geshe Langri Thangpa, as many of you might have heard, is also known as the Geshe Mursutua. Mursutua means gloomy face. Because Geshe Langri Thangpa is said to have never smiled, or at least his students never saw him smile, and always had a very dark face, sort of a sad and a gloomy face. And he's said to have been asked by his students, especially in bigger congregations, Master, would you like to please smile a little bit so that you look a little bit more pleasant, at least to the ones who approach you for the teachings? And Langri Thangpa is said to have always said, if you look at how ignorant sentient beings are and how much they suffer due to their own ignorance, there is no reason for me to smile at all. So when I reflect upon the ignorance and the suffering that sentient beings willingly create for themselves, it is what then makes me so very filled with sadness. And so Langri Thangpa is said to have, however, smiled once in his life. And that is when he was meditating, and he found a little mice climb on his shrine and tried to steal a big piece of turquoise that was kept on the shrine as an offering. And the turquoise being 3 times the size of the mice, and still the mice not giving up and trying to steal the turquoise. And Langri Thangpa is said to have laughed out loud at that time, one time, saying, "This mice reminds me of sentient beings grasping." And so that is again said to be one of the moments where he smiled. And so Chekawa found that Langri Thangpa had written this, and filled with devotion, expressed great aspiration to go and be at the feet of Langri Thangpa to study the development, cultivation of the bodhichitta teachings. And then he found out that Langri Thangpa had passed away at that time. And so he was filled with sadness, but was very happy when he finds that Sharawa, the student, the heart and the main student of Langri Thangpa, was still alive. And so Chekawa received the Cultivating bodhichitta teachings and how to truly cultivate genuine bodhichitta, the heart essence of the Buddha's teachings, from this great master Sharawa. And the teachings that he received from Sharawa, and then Chekawa compiling and transcribing those teachings, is the format of the Lojong, the teachings that we have today. So whenever we say, I'm practicing Lojong, and within Lojong there are 7 points and 59 slogans. The way it is compiled, when we say Lojong, it simply means, someone who studied it, means 7 points of mind training that are further elaborated within 59 practices called 59 slogans. But this format was not the format of the earlier times. So as the teachings of the Buddha evolved and were taught, Atisha's teachings were taught. Atisha then taught in Tibet. It went to Kungadrom Sum, then it went to Geshe Langri Thangpa, it went to Chekawa, it went to Sharawa. But from Sharawa, then Chekawa receiving it, and then Chekawa then made it very popular. When he compiled it as 7 points and 59 slogans, the teachings somehow gained the vividness. Not that the earlier teachings were not vivid, but it made it very accessible to the common mind of the people. It has a very colloquial, common man's language. It makes the teachings very, very alive and very, very something that we can all become very intimately touched by this. And so the format of what we today have, therefore, is known as the Chekawas, 7 points and 59 slogans of the teachings. So when we say the history or the source of the transmissions, those who are studying Lojong should always know. It's from the Buddha to Atisha and then to Chekawa. So the 3 prominent names, if we don't remember all the names, Chekawa, and then from there onwards, many different commentaries have been written. And then what we have today here is the commentary of Jamgon Khodro Lodro Thai. So that's the first classification, source of the transmissions. Second classification is then stating the vision of these teachings. Now, to be able to understand what is the vision of Lojong teachings, one must first cultivate a little bit of introspection to discovering. And many of you being practitioners, this is what you normally always are doing, and that is to spend time looking at mind, one's own mind, and its instinctive or intuitive ability, natural inclination towards kindness, towards goodness, towards genuine heart of kindness. Last night, just before I was about to go to sleep, the nuns from Samtense in India, where I come from, sent me a message and a picture. Someone had driven past the nunnery and in a sack had thrown, they usually do that, is that they thrown a dog whose gut was just coming out because he had someone had, I think, put a knife or however it was, but most of his inner guts were all coming out. So they sent me a picture and they were asking about, they were all in a sort of a frenzy of trying to get him to a hospital and give him some surgery. This photograph, which was very difficult of the little dog suffering, I showed it to Anila Kalden and then I showed it to Jigme next door. And both of them, and if I showed it to you, you would also probably do the same thing, is you cringe. Physically, you feel the pain. It's almost unbearable for you to see. Now this is what I mean by natural inclination. On a side note, the dog is still in surgery, just so that you sort of don't leave that question. But that's one side of the thing. What I mean to point out is that when you do see this, when you see a being suffering, when you see someone in a sad situation or in a distress, Buddhists, those who've learned or not, or those who have heard such a word as bodhichitta or not, instinctively feel the pain. And that's how you develop a sense of, oh, so sad, whether you're able to do something about it or not, but mentally and physically when you feel and you really sort of cringe at the idea of suffering. And likewise, if someone shows you a picture of a sweet puppy or a little baby or a beautiful flower, there is an instinctive intuitiveness about liking it. No, this is beautiful. This is something nice. It makes you physically have the pleasure and the joy. Recognizing this instinctive, intuitive call and connection towards something good, pure love, and repulsion to that what is pain, suffering, something that is a cause of unhappiness to yourself and the others, is said to be the most remarkable, powerful indication of basic goodness. That the innate nature has a natural affinity to something that is the basis of happiness, that is good, and that it has a natural repulsion towards that what is the basis of unhappiness towards oneself and the sufferings of oneself or the others. Recognizing this is extremely important because this is the resource, this is the basis upon which bodhicitta is going to be cultivated. When you don't recognize this natural, inherent, instinctive, intuitiveness towards something that is basically good, then one tends to imagine compassion, love, happiness, all of these to being external qualities that need to be cultivated. Mahayana teaching's view is these are wonderful qualities, however not extrinsic of one's own self. It is intrinsic. But for you to be able to introduce yourself to that intrinsic basic goodness, you have to have a sense of connection to feeling and examining and knowing this intuitive call towards basic goodness that you feel within one's own self. Now, closely together with recognizing this intuition, that intrinsic sort of impulse that you feel towards basic goodness, you have to then again recognize another potent power or energy, and that is, let me give you an example first. I talk about a dog who is in immense pain and suffering, and you instinctively feel, oh, how sad, how very sad, how I hope the animal is good, gets help, that's one. And then the next moment, your phone falls on the floor. Your cell phone or your pen falls on the floor, or someone knocks you from behind on the chair, kicks you from behind, and your mind shifts immediately. Second power is to understand immediate shift back to something else. So this points to two things. Yes, there is a natural, intuitive recognition of goodness and kindness, but it is so easily interrupted, and it is interrupted by self. The importance of, oh, my cell phone, oh, my pen, how dare you kick me from behind? Why does this person look like this? Oh, the air conditioning is not working. Or maybe I need to stretch my legs. Whatever it is. But the two energies that we are looking at, two powers we are looking at, an instinctive, intuitive impulse that really, truly wishes to be kind, and yet how easily that kindness and the expression of kindness becomes sort of hijacked by the habituation of self and self-cherishing, self-grasping. Now, self-grasping, as many of you who have studied Buddhism know about the different tendencies of self-grasping, but to keep it very simple is to know the involvement with one's own self. And there are two facets to that. Self-grasping, or the habit of self-cherishing, has two, of all the many different aspects, two main things. One is that the self is true, and the second is that the self is the most important. This is how we work with. These are the two impulses. I am here. This is me. This is what is mine. So often jokingly I say, when you live with self-cherishing for a long period of time and you become really habituated about thinking about your own self only, and especially in the modern world, when the self is always said to be the most important thing, you start teaching children. And when we speak with parents, for example, or when I observe parents, you see parents tell children things like, oh, you're the most important one in the world. You matter. What you like and what you dislike are the most important things. Culturally, we begin to allow ourselves to begin to develop a view where I usually say, the whole universe ends up with only three citizens. I, me, and myself. That's only, the whole world comprises of just I, me, myself. That is then Da Chinzin, we say in Tibetan, where you hold the self to being the most important, and that it is the only thing that really matters. And this then is what we allow our brain and our mind to be fixated with. Now when you stand with that fixation, that idea of the self being real, self being the most important, this becomes then sort of the opposite to what is the natural inclination towards the kindness. So we are left in a state of sort of a dilemma where you do have kindness, but the kindness is immediately shifted when the self-cherishing becomes very important. So you want to be generous, but then you forget so often because the self has to be protected most importantly. There are basically in Mahayana teachings we say 5 things that makes us, 5 branches through which the self-cherishing is then sort of becomes stronger, and we sustain and nourish this. Focus. Self-cherishing, when you hold yourself to being the most important, when you think, oh, it is only me that really matters most, first obstruction that this kind of a self-cherishing brings about is said to be the focus, the vision or the focus of your mind becomes very linear. In that being very linear, you see only yourself. When you enter a room full of people, you usually begin to have that attitude of saying, I, in this room full of people, and the I dominates everything else. Where you sit, whether you're comfortable or not, whether you get what you are not, that becomes sort of the main vision. That's linear vision, where the vision becomes so linear and focused only on the self and its own comfort, that this slowly breeds disregard of the well-being of the others. Now this is why it is said always in the teachings that although the human mind's basic nature is kind, genuinely kind, and we see that there is a natural, as I said earlier, natural inclination towards the kindness, to really wishing to be kind and generous to the others, but it has to withstand the habitual force of the self-cherishing, where the vision it holds is me. So it's always me and then the kindness. And it's about which one will outweigh which one. Because of this, we are here in a room trying to understand how to cultivate compassion. I always say, one of the greatest irony is the fact that we have to become Buddhist to actually learn how to be loving and kind. Now, Buddhism is marvelous, wonderful, profound. Let's all agree on that, right? It's the best. I hear that this has a long line of many churches and so on and so forth. We can say, no, but this is the best one here. Now, jokes aside, but if you really look at the Buddhist teachings, you have to sometimes sit down and think, this is really ironical, that what Buddhism teaches is not anything that is new. Buddhist teachings are always introducing you to the very fact of what a human being can cultivate and is endowed with. But nevertheless, we have to become Buddhist, we have to relate to teacher, we have to come and establish a shrine room like this, and then you sit there and I sit here, and then we have all of these different mechanisms or rituals or whatever you may call it. On a good side, it's useful. This is what really awakens us. But on the other hand, you can absolutely do it without. Isn't it? Because you could just be compassionate, and that's the end. Be nothing but kind. Patrul Rinpoche, one of the greatest teachers in the Dzogchen teachings, he says, be kind. And that contains every teaching, every view, every practice. Just be kind. Now, the simplicity, however, escapes us. We need someone to ring the gong, to sort of sit down in a certain posture and develop that same kind attitude. And that is the irony. Nevertheless, the point here that I'm trying to make is nobody, so likewise the teachings of Mahayana says, nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I'm going to be nothing but selfish. I'm going to be jealous of everybody today. I'm going to be the most obnoxious person anyone sees around. Nobody plans that way. You do actually quite the opposite. And as Buddhists, we start the day by saying something like, may all sentient beings, our mothers, have happiness in the cause of happiness, and so on and so forth. While the wish and the aspiration is that way, it is not the negative. Nevertheless, we forget. Nevertheless, we have to rely upon mechanisms of a view, of a philosophy. We have to have teachers and teachings and meditation and more formats and shrines and practices and recitations and so on and so forth. Why? Is simply because this innate nature is forgotten so very easily. It is forgotten so very easily because we allow the habit of self-cherishing to be there. So why the self is vilified so much throughout the Buddhist teachings is not because the self is bad, but it is because the self becomes so linear in its view of its own self, and it dominates everything that you see. That your comfort dominates everyone else's comfort. Your wish dominates everybody else's wishes. Your well-being must be protected, whether it then harms or hurts somebody else. And that then, because the self-cherishing brings about this kind of a linear vision, therefore self-cherishing, and why Mahayana Buddhism really first emphasizes understanding the nature, the empty nature of the self, and why that became the basis of the Mahayana. And the second turning of the wheel of Dharma is this. First, at the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, and through which the self and the emptiness of self is emphasized, is simply so that once you get it out of your system, that the self is really not the most important. The self is not the only thing existent, that actually the self doesn't even exist. That other than it being a supposition of one's own mind, that it doesn't exist, therefore removing the self-cherishing to allowing this innate, natural intuition, or the genuine sense of natural quality of basic goodness that is truly able to really wish happiness for oneself and the others to be powerfully generated. That then became the whole basis of all the teachings, such as the Lojong teachings. So therefore, self-cherishing and continued self-cherishing, first thing is, it makes it very linear in its focus. As I said, there are 5. Second is, it makes you very rigid. Rigidity is oneself above all, uncompromising. If it is not what I want, then it doesn't exist. Then it is not true. Then it is not possible. When the rigidity of the self comes about. So in your own mind, observe the natural inclination to genuinely loving and being patient and kind to the others, but also observe the impulses, the habitual impulses of self-cherishing. And how is this self-cherishing evident? By seeing whether you are someone allowing the continuation of linear vision to be there. Then examine again whether you are holding on to a rigid view, where you're very rigid in what the self wants, and it's very uncompromising and sort of unconditionally it wants only what it wants. The third is then said to be the mark of self-cherishing, the aspect or how you can see whether the self-cherishing is strong in oneself or not, is said to be demanding. When you become very demanding and you become very egotistical in your demand, you sort of demand others to almost be like you. And that is how we think, isn't it? Everyone should be kind. And then you demand that. In the sanghas, this is very much there. There are so very, and I'm sure that it's the same experience everywhere, so it must be here as well. Sometimes people come in and say, I didn't think the sangha would be like this. And then we sometimes say, so how did you expect? And they say things, I wanted the sangha to be always patient, always open, always flexible for me. And then we say, this sangha is not being a good Buddhist sangha because the sangha doesn't understand me, the sangha doesn't appreciate me, the sangha doesn't support me. So this is, of course, understandable how you feel, an example, but sometimes you have to look, maybe you are becoming very egotistical in your demand when you expect everyone to think like you do, everyone to believe like you do, everyone to behave like you do, everyone to say the things like you want them to say. And therefore, it becomes linear, it becomes very, very rigid, it becomes very egotistical in its demands. And then the fourth is because of these three, it becomes very unreasonable. You become very unreasonable and irrational. Sometimes you become like you treat others, even in your families, as if they are a jukebox. You have the jukebox where you put a coin and you press the kind of song that you want to hear, and it plays the song what you want. So in the same way you treat one another as a jukebox, is that you say things like, I've seen that, when partners say, I love you to one another. Now when it is very new, the romance is very new, then maybe there's a little bit of genuineness. But as the relationship goes, older and sort of more, then there are still, and this I say for women, I think we women, I've noticed that a lot, is women always say, I love you to whoever their partner is, and they really expect, maybe the men do the same thing, but I don't know, I've never had a time to ask. But but in this example, they say, I love you, and there's a pause. And then the jukebox is that the other person better answer, I love you too. Is it? If there is no response, or the response is not quite with the same impactful melody that you expect it to be, mind becomes immediate, you don't love me anymore. What happened? You used to say that a lot more. You used to say that 21 times every day. Now you do it only 3 times every day. That is the unreasonable, irrational mind. It's not only in just a relationship, but we begin to become, the self and the self-cherishing builds an irrational, unreasonable demand over the others. That's mark of self-cherishing. Fifth is said to be, because it becomes very linear, it tends to, then you allow it to become rigid, you allow it to being very demanding and egotistical in its demand, you allow the irrational, unreasonable demands to be continued, and then the fifth is, you simply become, and the English word is best, we don't even have this word in Tibetan as well, as the English word it is that you become smug. You become very smug in yourself, and then that's the smugness. And if you drive down, what is this, I-92? And you look out of the window here and there, there's a lot of smugness, and it's just sort of everyone there, especially when the traffic is bad. It's a sort of, how dare, my space, my freedom, my voice, my choice, my ideas, that then smugness, and filled with your own self, unflexible, and not really being willing to go beyond your own smugness. And we sustain this habit. We allow ourselves to keep this pattern and this habit. And that is then what, as I said, makes you more and more dependent upon becoming a Buddhist to be able to learn how to love. You become dependent upon teachers to teach you how to love. You become dependent upon methods of meditation and practices and recitation before you begin to do a simple thing as respond to your natural nature of loving kindness and compassion. In a way, Geshe Langri Thangpa, the gloomy-faced Geshe, was absolutely right in his gloominess. If you sit down to think how smug we have become, and because of our unreasonable, irrational, demanding, linear, egotistical smugness, how you have to today then, despite your bad back and bad knees, still meditate before you begin to then think, I can be more generous, I can be more kind. You have to make notes and recordings and books and texts and follow teachers around the world before you begin to think, oh, I should probably not be so smug. It's really foolish trying to be so out there, caught in my own demanding, self-cherishing mind, following an illusion of who you are and not responding to what is the natural capacity and the nature and the ability to have generosity, which is intrinsic of yourself. Generosity is not necessarily a Buddhist thing. Generosity is just the natural inclination you have. Likewise, being ethical, being truly kind to the others is nothing about being Buddhist. It is something that is naturally inherent of ourselves. Patience is not something that is in the domain of Buddhist teachings. Patience is the most natural ability that a human mind has. Likewise, with genuine awareness, genuine basic goodness, genuine loving kindness and compassion, these are all natural, inherent within our own selves. However, not knowing this, being lost in the self-cherishing, and then, as the text says, because of these 5 aspects, linear, rigidity, demanding, irrational or unreasonable, and this sort of cloistered in one's own smugness, these tendencies, although the natural ability of kindness and love, the intrinsic inclination towards basic goodness is there, we still suffer from the 3 conditions: non-tolerance, non-flexibility, and Shinjang Meba in Tibetan we say, whereas non-flexibility or non-pliancy, and the third one is Kongchowa, which would literally translated is aggression, holds aggression. You become aggressive. There is it's more to do with passive aggressiveness. There is an overt aggression, but this kind of a Kongchowa is more passive aggression. In sort of trying to understand really how the English translation might be, it is almost not giving any space for the others. When you don't give any freedom and space to the others, that is probably a passive aggression that you hold within one's own self. So the self-cherishing, now how we are going through is self-cherishing, which then arises in the form of these 5 things that we talked about, the linear, rigidity and unreasonable demand and so forth. These 5, and then continuing with these 5 develops as a fruit, as a result, these 3 conditions: non-tolerance, non-flexibility, and not giving freedom or space to the others, or passive aggression. And so these 3 things are all said to be signs of absence of bodhicitta. Now, although bodhicitta is the natural nature, so you can't really be absent of bodhicitta. But the natural bodhicitta is subjugated, it is subdued or overpowered by these 3 conditions. So, in the beginning, for meditators wishing to understand how to tame one's own mind, you must know clearly what it is that you're working with. You're working to really develop your own natural nature, and this natural nature being intrinsic, nevertheless, overwhelmed by these patterns. Which patterns? Patterns of non-tolerance. Examine in yourself and see the degree of tolerance that you have or that you do not have. And that will sort of give you a good understanding of how much you have to work in taming your mind to transform this non-tolerance into genuine tolerance, and non-flexibility into flexibility, and the third being the aggression, the passive aggression that does not give others freedom to be, does not give others the space to be, and therefore it becomes very demanding of the others. Observing and seeing that if these 3 conditions are there, then this is where the natural bodhicitta is being overpowered, and taming the mind then simply means removing these conditions, removing these patterns, removing these, and then ultimately the root is, of course, self-cherishing and self-grasping. So dissolving self-grasping allows one to truly manifest the inherent bodhicitta. In the root text, it's simply written as that. And so when we say removing or purifying or letting go of self-grasping, many times we think, oh yes, I should let go of self-grasping. But what does it really mean? There is no self. And therefore to let go of the self-grasping can often be so vague that you don't really, you recognize what it means, but you really don't know what are the basic ingredients with which you have to begin to work. So therefore it becomes helpful to sort of backtrack and say, yes, to let go of the self, be more tolerant. Allow oneself to really generate and have developed better flexibility. Allow space for the others to be. Don't be too demanding. Don't be so smug. Don't be so irrational in your demands. Don't be egotistical. Do not be so linear in your sort of vision. And especially don't be rigid. Be a little bit more flexible towards the others. And you will find that within that, being able to let go of these conditions and aspects, you will be working with demolishing the stronghold of self-cherishing, the habit of self-cherishing. And this is then the very basic principle of all the Buddhist teachings, especially the Mahayana teachings we talk about, which teach on the path of many different methods of letting go of self-cherishing. So this is one way to look at it. Then the next question is, what is the most potent antidote to let go of self-cherishing? All of the teachings, as I said, of Mahayana, especially the studies of views and understanding through analysis and examination the emptiness nature of the self, and thereby demolishing the habit of self-grasping, that's the most sort of the strongest or the direct way of working with destabilizing the fortress of the self and the self-cherishing attitude. But from a practitioner's perspective, from a much more common person's engaged way of working with reducing the stronghold of self-cherishing, Mahayana teachings, especially the Lojong teachings and in the teachings of Jetsun Khandro Rinpoche, he says, refuge is the most powerful antidote to the self-cherishing. Now refuge has to be understood carefully here too again. There is the refuge. I take refuge into the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. For many beginners on the path of the practice, seeing the Buddha as the epitome of qualities of the enlightened mind, seeing the Dharma as that which holds the treasure of the teachings of the Absolute Truth, Sangha of Bodhisattvas as the examples to follow and gain support with, and relying on these three, Kunchoksum, three rare and sublime ones, and there's sort of the easier way to refer to them as being the three jewels, into whom you surrender and take refuge, becomes a very powerful approach. This is for a lot of the people, and especially if we talk about Easterners, Tibetans, and the other Asian countries, relating devotedly to the object of refuge and surrendering to the qualities of the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha is a very unique, marvelous way of really going beyond the self-cherishing mind. In the modern world, sometimes people say, oh, that is blind faith. If you don't examine carefully, there's a danger always of blind faith, and blind faith doesn't really help. But to argue the point, just to sort of argue the point, sometimes you have to think, what is it that resists from surrendering to the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha? And you'll usually find no better answer than saying it's the ego that resists. So how good a message can the ego give you? You know, the ego will say, be careful, don't surrender, hold on to me. Now, if you think that message of the ego is trustworthy, then you could probably criticize many of the sort of the devoted people who simply surrender into the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. I think sometimes they are much more powerful. I often give the example of my grandmother, my mother's mother, who has now since passed away several years ago. But when she was alive, it was very interesting because her son-in-law was His Holiness my root teacher, and then she was surrounded by many teachers throughout the monastery, many teachers. And throughout, at least my life, because she was my mother's mother, my grandmother, I used to often tell her, read the Heart Sutra, study on emptiness, there is nothing to hold. Because she would always say, after I die, I'm going to go to straight the Pure Land. And then we used to say, maybe you'd like to examine, there's no such thing as Pure Land other than your own pure nature of mind. So we used to try and get her to understand Madhyamika, or to examine, see emptiness, nature, and so forth. And she would get furious because she would say, this is all chatter. You go into emptiness, I go to Amitabha. She used to be very straightforward in that. And I may or may not have been so successful in introducing emptiness to any one of the other Buddhists. I could never do that to my grandmother. Right to the last of the moment, she was very straightforward, and it used to be very exasperating to me sometimes. But nowadays, I look back and I think, maybe she's better. She knows a lot more. Because she used to tell me, it's about surrenderance. When I surrender my ego to Amitabha, and that's it. That's a pure object. And that pure object is much better than my neurotic mind. My neurotic mind can just surrender itself into the pure nature of Amitabha. Today I sit down and I think, with all whatever knowledge, scholastic knowledge that we may have, surrenderance of that kind into the absolute nature is not even vaguely similar to the kind of surrenderance she had. So therefore, yes, blind faith can be very debilitating, also is not what I'm talking about. But on the other hand, refuge is about surrenderance. Now the object of surrenderance, that's where Buddhism talks about. The object of surrenderance, if it is tangible, like my grandmother would be, is Amitabha is there, and I used to say, where's your Amitabha? She would point up in the sky, and then she would really have this very straightforward idea of where she was going. Now, from at least what I think is that, yes, it's a conceptual belief, isn't it? And compared to non-conceptual idea of the absolute truth, a conceptual pure object is less, because it's a pure thing, but it's a conceptual pure object. So we say non-conceptual absolute is the supreme object, into a supreme source into which we then surrender. Now this is here. Now my non-conceptual supreme surrender, what is it? And sometimes I think I'm just using words, because the mind still is fearful, mind still aspires, mind still hopes. So therefore, in some ways, a very simple surrenderance into the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. Buddha as the supreme enlightened being, this yellow-bodied being up on the shrine, teachings, surrendering into the truth of the Dharma, and then taking refuge into the Sangha of the Bodhisattvas, examples of whom you would like to follow. That simple surrenderance is also very wonderful, and I think that's also very remarkable, very powerful. It is also that very potent, no matter how conceptual it may be, but that concept purifies the other concept of the ego, and that is what is most important. So however, this is just a point that I wanted to make for many of you who are Easterners and then have this Eastern sort of an outlook. But Jammu Khandro Lodothae here then does not refer to that. And here he says, the most powerful antidote to self-cherishing is refuge, and the refuge has to be into the definitive meaning of what are the objects of refuge. And therefore he says, to the innate nature, the truth, and the awareness. Here therefore it says, Buddha is the innate nature, the very fundamental, innate quality of your own absolute nature of mind. That is the primordial Buddha. When you surrender yourself to taking refuge into that innate nature, that is taking refuge into the Buddha. Taking refuge into the Dharma is said to be the absolute definitive truth. Whatever is the truth, and at that point, not even the Buddhist truth, but whatever is the absolute nature, whatever is the true nature as it arises, remaining steadfast and unshaken, confident within that nature, is then said to be surrendering, taking refuge into the Dharma. And then there's the awareness, the awakened awareness that supports your refuge into the Buddha and the Dharma. The awareness that allows you to meet the innate nature, the awareness that keeps you focused and steadfast and not distracted from the absolute truth as it is. And that then awareness and taking or refuge or surrendering into that awareness is then the taking refuge into the Sangha. So therefore, meditatively taking refuge into the innate nature, the truth as it is, and the awareness that becomes the basis of remaining awakened within this state is said to be the absolute or the definitive refuge. And so the absolute refuge, you can call it absolute refuge too. So taking absolute refuge as often as you can, surrendering yourself into the refuge in this way is the most powerful antidote to demolishing self-cherishing and self-grasping. It is with this that in Buddhist tradition, especially the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, we do not begin any day or any session without doing refuge and bodhichitta practices. And why we take refuge every day is not just because we are connecting to Buddhist traditions of a different kind, but it is your way of saying that at the very core essential point of really embodying the teachings of the Buddha, it's all about surrendering to the innate nature, remaining steadfast within the absolute truth as it is, and generating the awareness that sustains and is the basis of this refuge. And from that ground of refuge, when my mind is awakened to its own intrinsic nature of basic goodness and kindness, that is then the bodhicitta practice. You can make it conceptual as we do, relative as we do, by reciting, may all beings have happiness and the cause of happiness, be free from suffering. And there are many different kinds of bodhicitta recitations. You did a very long recitation before we began the session this morning. All of these are means and methods, essentially bringing your mind back to training its own self. And how it trains itself is through surrendering to the innate nature. May my mind just manifest what is its natural impulse, natural inclination of basic goodness and kindness. In that way, you take refuge into your innate primordial mind, and from the ground of that primordial pure mind, you manifest what is your natural quality of basic goodness, basic ground of loving kindness and compassion for all sentient beings. If you're able to just do that, you don't have to recite anything. You don't have to visualize anything. You don't have to even refer to yourself as being a student of this or that lineage or teacher, or having to read many different teachings and so forth. That is what is genuinely the very core essence of all the Buddhist teachings. And therefore, it is with that Jetsun Khandro Rinpoche refers to taking refuge as the most potent antidote to the self-cherishing mind. It is that refuge that you take that then demolishes the stronghold of the habitual tendencies of self-cherishing. So therefore, in the text it says, taking refuge should be built with the cultivation of the three qualities: surrenderance, trust, and confidence. Again, refuge also builds up to being more and more strong. First is surrendering into the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, or surrendering into the innate nature, the truth, and the awareness, with strong intention allows the beginning of the changes to happen. So the surrenderance is the first. Second is not only surrendering, but there has to be trust. Trust in the basic goodness. Now trust is then where the English word usually we use is faith. And many people say, what's the concept of faith for a Buddhist practitioner? And we say, well, you have to have faith in the Dharma, or you have to have faith in the Buddha and the faith in the teacher and so forth. It should be understood correctly. Faith is about trust. Trust is not being trusted into an object. Trust is much more to do with the subjective mind. Trust is being able to really trust your own basic nature and the ground of basic goodness that is inherent of one's own self. Where you hold that trust, everything else is already there. Even if you trusted the teacher, what would that actually mean? It would have no basis if what the teacher taught was not what you are cultivating. But in your cultivating the basic principle of what is being pointed out in the Mahayana teachings, then the faith in the teacher, the faith in the lineage, all of this is then simultaneously or spontaneously there. So therefore, surrendering with the strong intention, and then trusting in the basic goodness being the second. And the third in this is courage to abide. The third is courage. Now, not only surrendering, but trusting the basic goodness. Not only just trusting the basic goodness, but having a firm, unshakable confidence and being able to abide within that confidence. And then again, the word in Tibetan, or in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, devotion. And many people say, what is devotion? Here again, devotion is courage. Devotion is confidence. A courageous confidence of your own innate nature, being true to itself, and in that truthfulness towards your own innate nature, when you allow it to manifest and become more stronger than the self-cherishing habits, that is then devotion. If you're able to do that, you are truly a devoted practitioner of the Dharma. You are a truly devoted student of your own teacher, and therefore devotion is then very important. So therefore these three qualities, not only taking refuge, but surrendering into the refuge, trusting the refuge, and then having the confidence, the courage and the confidence of the refuge. These three qualities, if you're able to truly keep, collectively, the combination of these three qualities, surrendering to the true refuge, trusting the true refuge, and confidence of the true refuge, three things collectively are called Lojong. That's what is Lojong. So, again, this is the second time I'm giving you a chance to then end the talk. So this is the short length, medium length, and then the long length here. So medium length is again here. Then you don't have to memorize 59 slogans and 7 points and so on and so forth. So if you sort of like to keep it precise and short, then this is again very much there. So refuge into the innate nature, the Dharma, the truth, and the Sangha is the basic awareness. Surrendering into it, trusting this, and having utter confidence of resting within this, that then is called the Lojong teachings or the Lojong trainings. Furthermore, as the text says, being able to cultivate this, and therefore again here we must say, many of you through the kindness of many of your teachers and all of the great masters who come and give you all the teachings and the instructions, most of us do try to do this. If you look, every day we try to take refuge, every day we try to defeat self-cherishing, we try to cultivate bodhichitta, and so forth. But nevertheless, simultaneously, none of us are here who do not recognize how easy it is to forget, how easy it is to still, we take refuge and yet we forget. We generate bodhichitta, but it still becomes very diluted. So therefore, in the teachings, again, minor teachings, it says, in order to support this trust, in order to support this surrenderance, this trust, and the confidence, again, it is very important for meditators to continually recognize and generate a sense of how important it is to recognize the pain and the sufferings of the others, and to re-understand or reconnect with the mind, as we talked about earlier, the natural inclination to really feel strongly about the sufferings of the others. So therefore, in the minor teachings, reflecting on the sufferings of the sentient being and wishing them to be free from the causes of suffering of the sentient beings is highly emphasized, because that is what awakens the mind to being able to then understand how important it is to develop one's own sense of refuge into the inner nature. And so here it says, innate sensitive understanding and recognition of others' pain, and having a natural inclination to recognizing the pain of the others and extend our sympathy should be recognized. So again and again, look at this mind that you have that feels the sympathetic attitude towards the others. But as I said before, it forgets so very easily. It again sees, it wishes, and you and I sit in meditation wanting to develop this compassion, and yet it just takes the end of the session. The moment you do the dedication of merit and we start leaving the room, the mind forgets again the whole purpose of what we were trying to meditate and learn over here. And in this case, Jamgung Khodro Loto Thaya says, a meditator should understand the distinction between sensitive mind and compassionate mind. So long as you sustain only a sympathetic attitude, that, however, which cannot withstand forgetting and distraction, is a sensitive mind. That which can not only recognize the suffering of the other, but be powerful enough to withstand the habit of distraction and your own self-cherishing habits, is a compassionate mind. This is very important to keep in mind, because a lot of people use the term compassion and bodhicitta very loosely. You know, a shopkeeper gives you a discount and people say things like, she's a bodhisattva. your grandmother or grandaunt leaves you $20,000 in her will, oh, she's a bodhisattva. Which, you never know where a bodhisattva is. It could be very much so. You can't really refute it in that way. But sometimes I feel you use it very loosely, the term. So when you use it very loosely, it sort of diminishes all the qualities that it actually must be there. So there is a sympathetic attitude, and then there is a kind mind, which is not necessarily a bodhicitta mind, a compassionate mind. So therefore here, the whole point of why we are trying to see the distinction of this both is for you to, because the chapter is about, the classification is about vision, the direction of the Lojong teachings. And so you have to keep in mind that the Lojong teachings is not about cultivating sensitive attitude. It's about cultivating bodhicitta, uncompromising compassion. And that's why it's very important to keep the vision very direct and very straightforward. Sensitive mind, all of us have it, and we try to work with it. What it means is it's a kind mind, but it's very forgetful in its kindness. It appreciates love and generosity and tolerance and so forth, but it very conveniently forgets it when the self is threatened. So that's a sensitive mind. You're working in Lojong to take this sensitive mind to be even more brave, to be even more continued, to be more freer from the self-cherishing and the habits of the self-cherishing attitude. And therefore, then again, furthermore, it says, in order to transition from a sensitive mind to a compassionate bodhicitta mind, foremost of all the teachings is to be able to understand the sameness of self and the others. This is very important. Usually when we teach, or whenever we refer to bodhicitta practices, the four immeasurables are always taught. Loving kindness is the first one. Second is compassion. Third is joyfulness or rejoicement in the accomplishment of the others. And the fourth is equanimity. These are called four immeasurables. We recite them as, may all beings have happiness and the cause of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. May those in a state of happiness, devoid of suffering, never be separated from such a state. And that may all sentient beings be free from the extremes of discrimination, bias, passion, and aggression, or may all sentient beings enjoy perfect equanimity. When we read, when we recite, when we think these are called generating the four immeasurables. Now, great masters, particularly if you look at Jetsun Rinpoche, or if you refer to even the great omniscient one, Longchenpa, or even the teachings of Jigme Lingpa, you will find one of the emphasis that all of these great teachers who have taught extensively on the subject of bodhicitta, they say, you cannot reach the four immeasurables without the first three. So they refer to 7 immeasurables instead of 4 immeasurables, which I don't see very often people talk so much or refer to them so much. First immeasurable, they say, is think of all sentient beings as your mother. Now, many of you have heard this term, all mother-like sentient beings. If I say how many of you have not heard it, there's hardly any hand, unless you're really, jumped into this room accidentally somehow, sort of very fresh new. You'll have heard this term. But having heard it, how many of us spend time really thinking about it? Are all sentient beings, when you look into the eyes of another being, do you really see your mother? And this is not just fancy words, not being lost in the rhetorics of all this, but do you really see a sense of, oh, just as I hold the mother of this lifetime as being so kind and so dear to me, when I look at Anila Kauden and I say, oh, she is my mother, no different than my mother, she is my mother, she has been my mother in one lifetime or the other, many lifetimes she's been like my mother, and I find a sense of strong connection, of sameness of my mother and Kaldinla here as my mother, do I really feel it that way or not? If you really are going to transition from a sensitive mind to a bodhichitta mind, you'll have to first work with this concept, is that do you hold everyone as dear, as important, as much an object of love? And then you take someone who really irritates you, and then you say, that is my mother. That's also been my mother in one lifetime or the other. Is as dear to. There's no difference between the mother I love in this life and this one he has or she has. It has been my mother. And truly seeing the sameness between your happiness and the happiness of this, the freedom from suffering of myself and my mother of this lifetime, and the wish for freedom from suffering of this person in the same light, such that eventually you can develop the eyes, the vision, the eyes that sees the sameness of all sentient beings. If you don't start there, then you'll be lost in fancy words. Compassion for all limitless sentient beings. When I was much younger and receiving teachings from our teachers, Rinpoche used to sometimes always say, your kind of compassion is like ant-like compassion, is a sort of petty compassion. And then I used to get very irritated when Rinpoche said that, because I thought I was trying my best, trying to be compassionate. And one day he told me, close your eyes. And he said, when you dedicate merit, whom are you dedicating to? And then I was sort of trying to think, whom am I to? Sentient beings. We say, sky likes boundless number of sentient beings. And what do I mean by them? And then you begin to realize you actually have no idea whom you mean. It's just dots, so sort of many dots. And then sort of I found myself thinking, I dedicate all my merit to whoever you are. I'm giving. It's your responsibility to take or not take. Because we sort of become a little bit egoistic in our generosity of merit. And we think, yes, I'm giving, but whoever you are. And that's why you have this English word, etc. Isn't it? And so forth. When I write sometimes, and I don't want to write too much, then you say, this, and so forth, ... Isn't it? So our relationship itself begins with this sense of, all sentient beings. And then you leave it at that being very abstract. Now, somewhere along the line, the self-cherishing mind will then begin to manipulate that tendency. And one of the things is, yes, you're a kind mind, and you have full right to be lazy enough to not think who is who. That's not your job. You should just be loving. And then it's up to them. The sentient beings, whether they see that or not, that's the smugness. I'm smug in my bodhichitta. May all sentient beings be free from the ocean of suffering and life and death and whatever the sunamdi, I don't know how it is translated in English, but you open a simple book like this, a recitation book, and it has all these wonderful things written in there. Where is the dedication here?
Page 22.
Page what?
22.
22. Let's look at it. Let's see the marvelous things we say. All right. By this virtue may I achieve omniscience. That's a smug. By defeating all enemies and confusion. Another smug. May all who travel the waves of the birth, old age, sickness, and death cross the ocean of samsara. It never crosses our mind to sometimes ask, however are we going to do all this? Isn't it? That's how we fool ourselves. Here we are talking about the difference between a sensitive mind. It's not that we are doing it in a very negative way. We do want sentient beings to cross the ocean of samsara. We do love them. But that's a sensitive mind, unless it can truly transcend this tendency of smugness, of self, patronizing attitude, the arrogance of even compassion. having compassion. To be able to then defeat that, here therefore the text says, and all these teachings say, begin by first seeing the sameness between self and the others. First, as I said, immeasurable is, therefore, seeing all sentient beings as being same, like your mother of this lifetime. Second, immeasurable, these great teachers say, before you start on loving kindness and compassion, second is, think about the compassion you have received. That's very important. To have bodhichitta, to have kindness towards the others is very important. But sometimes the ego manipulates, and the same smug ego will make itself, this is what I always say, shifting gears. The ego is very samsaric and self-cherishing. Then you become a Buddhist and you start receiving teachings, and the ego begins to feel the threat of the teachings and the practices that you are doing. And then there's a shifting of the gear where the ego says, okay, I may not survive in the worldly ways, I'm going to become a Buddhist. Ego becomes a Buddhist. That's where then we begin to think, it's just the smugness just shifts into being smug Buddhist. So that's where then we become sort of, we are practicing bodhicitta, we are the better ones. And then ask any Buddhist, what do you practice? They will say, compassion, bodhicitta. You talk about generosity, there's no Buddhist who will not go with, I know what it is. You talk to them about primordial wisdom, most Buddhists will say, yes, primordial wisdom, it's ours. Somehow sort of, we have the more control over generosity and perfection of samadhi and meditation and so forth. And there's a smugness. As I said earlier, there's a whole line of churches over here. We Buddhists will go, but they don't know. They don't know about bodhicitta. We know about bodhicitta. They don't know about innate Buddha nature. We know about innate Buddha nature. The Christians, they're very nice, they're very kind, but they're relative. We are absolute here. So that's the ego shifting gears. So it's the same thing. It's just moving into it, and it tries to survive doing this. In order to defeat such a hypocrisy or such a misunderstanding, misconception that you hold, here therefore, since we're talking about compassion, it is about seeing all sentient beings as same as one's own self, as our own mother. Second is to reflect upon the kindness of the others, such that a meditator, now Jigme Lingpa says in his teachings, he says, reflect so very carefully to see, is there anything in your life, now and through all successions of life, anything that you have that was entirely your own doing, and yet for which you did not depend on somebody else. And you begin to then think, how for everything, the knowledge I have, the life that I have, who I am today, where I am sitting, everything is because somebody made it possible. Someone else's kindness, someone else's contribution, that actually even the words that I can speak today are not my own. It is something that I have received from the others. But Rinpoche in his teachings say, if a meditator closely reflects, if you take a sip of a tea and you really reflect, in his teachings he say, just for a mouthful of tea you are dependent upon no less than 500 or more sentient beings who have contributed with their effort, with their kindness, with their generosity. And you and I are sitting in this wonderful shrine here. It's the hard work, not just of this generation of Buddhists who've made it, but of the people who used to live here before, the church it used to be before, the kindness of hundreds and thousands of people who have swept, cared for, taken care of. And then today is the moment where you and I can sit and we think we are being generous. We are being kind. I'm going to generate compassion for all sentient beings. And that you all should know I'm being compassionate. Whereas Jigme Lingpa's way of saying is, if you reflect upon how much compassion you have received from the others, Then comes the third point, the third immeasurable, which is repaying that compassion. How are you going to then repay that compassion? So seeing the sameness of all sentient beings. Second is reflecting upon the kindness you have received from the others, which naturally then gives birth to the third thought, how could you repay the kindness? And that is a big dent to the ego, where you then begin to say, what you are generating as compassion today for all sentient beings, the bodhichitta that you are trying to cultivate for all sentient beings, is just a small gesture in reflecting the kindness as a repayment to the kindness, as a gesture of what you could return for the kindness that one has received. So then you come back to a point with this, of course, you couldn't be anything but kind if you reflected upon how much you had received from the others. And so there's a sense of, yes, of course, what else could I do? And what I am doing is nothing really extraordinary. It's the least that I can do as a gesture of reciprocating that kindness towards the other sentient beings. And then you begin to think, how could I repay that kindness? What could I do that would in some small way be a sense of returning the kindness and the gratitude that I feel of the other people? And then you look around and you say, nothing else could do it other than loving kindness. And that's the birth of the first immeasurable, loving kindness or compassion or joyfulness in the accomplishment of the others and equanimity. So the four immeasurables, loving kindness, compassion, joyfulness, rejoicement, and equanimity, become the natural sort of the expressions that are born from the first three, seeing the sameness of self and the others, thinking about their kindness, and then thinking about ways of how could I repay the kindness to the others. And then you find, loving, giving love to the others, wishing them well, and obtaining happiness and the happiness, causes of happiness, wishing them freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering, wishing them to have joyfulness and rejoicing in their achievement of anything good that they are able to achieve, and then wishing happiness and equanimity for all sentient beings. That then 7 immeasurables become the basis of a kinder heart, and that is said to be the foundation. In that way then, when, as the teachings of the Lojong say, when the mind truly understands the sameness of the self and the others and an utter gratitude you feel for the kindness of the others, that then brings about the fragrance of true spirit of bodhicitta in your own mind. And in that way, you then begin to see training of your own mind to developing compassion for the others as a most natural expression of the gratitude that you feel for the others. This then diminishes what is usually a tendency. That's what you call in English patronizing attitude. So a lot of times when we generate compassion, there's a patronizing attitude. I am the one generating compassion for the benefit of all sentient beings. But if you look at how much you have been a recipient of the loving kindness of the others, your expression of kindness then loses the sense of arrogance, the sense of ego that is involved in it, and it becomes less overbearing to the others. And you begin to have a much more gentle approach to generating kindness and compassion to one's own self. So this then is said to be the basis of generating kindness and compassion for oneself and the others. I am going to stop for lunch over here with the second classification and then try to go into the third classification after the lunch break. So here this morning, just to sort of summarize, is that seeing the teachings coming from Atisha, Chekawa, as the 7 points, 59 slogans, but also summarizing them into one's own self. Bodhicitta, genuine heart of kindness and goodness, is the very natural nature inherent of one's own self. As the great Drikung Dharma Surya Center has said, surrendering into the innate nature, this basic goodness, being able to truly remain truthfully within it, and allowing the awareness to sustain, taking refuge in that way, is the way of training one's own mind. Through surrendering in this way, nevertheless, seeing how it gets interrupted by the habitual patterns of self-cherishing and self-grasping and all of its aspects, knowing that is why I have to train my mind. And being very clear, training the mind is not training the mind to be good. It's already good. That's your basic nature. You're training the mind only to remove all those habitual patterns of ego-cherishing, and that is where the training of the mind is. So the mind doesn't have to be trained. Whatever does not allow the mind to be true to its own nature, eliminating those veils of habitual patterns of ego-cherishing, that is then called training the mind. That's called Lojong. So if you keep that just in mind, that's also quite sufficient. So to then continue with some points in relation to the training the mind, or the Lojong teachings of Jetsun Khandro Rinpoche, based upon the profound Lojong teachings of Geshe Chekawa, and of course originating from the source, the great Atisha. So this morning we spoke about the first two classifications, the source of transmission and stating the direction or the vision of the teachings, why one practices the Lojong teachings. Now, prior to the third classification, just to quote, in the commentary of Jetsun Khandro Rinpoche, he quotes Nagarjuna when he says, the quote from Nagarjuna says, if the rest of humanity and I wish to attain unsurpassable awakening, the basis for this is bodhichitta, as stable as the kings of the mountains, compassion which touches everything, and wisdom that does not rely on duality. And within this quote, then one sees not only the emphasis given to the practice of compassion and bodhicitta, where he says, if one truly wishes to attain the unsurpassable awakening, there is really no other practice other than bodhicitta. Compassion is the very core essence of all of the practices. So in simple words, a simple language, it should be simply, if you are kind, you're on the right direction. If your mind is not kind, then no matter what you know of Buddha Dharma, however learned you may be, how many ever retreats you may have done, even if the greatest of the greatest teacher is in your first dialing number, and you have direct access to any of these teachers or whoever it may be, that's never impressive. That's never really having gotten what true Dharma actually is. But if a person, whether this person can, knows many different names, or doesn't know what lineages are, or doesn't know what the different methods are, or if you cannot sit on the cushion, or if you've never been to a retreat, or if you do not know the ABCs of what Buddhist languages may be, but if your mind is kind, then you have far more a pithier understanding of what Dharma is. So that's how it is. If you're kind, then you're truly on the path to realization. If you're not kind, and if the mind is still really inflated with its own self, and there is nothing beyond your own self-cherishing that is more important, then truly that is not having obtained any benefit of the Dharma. So therefore, if the rest of humanity and I wish to attain unsurpassable awakening, the basis of this is bodhicitta. And if the bodhicitta is as stable as the kings of the mountain, then that is truly having gotten the essence of Dharma. So bodhicitta comprises of the two qualities: compassion, which touches everything. That's the first. And second is wisdom that does not rely upon duality, wisdom that sees things as it truly is. And from that wisdom that sees truly things as it is, then if the bodhicitta, the heart of enlightened compassion, truly reaches and touches everything, then that's the very base of the Buddhist teachings. Therefore, Lojong training is the main emphasis. The vision of the Lojong itself is cultivating this bodhicitta and allowing the bodhicitta to be in union with the wisdom of non-duality. So therefore it says, bodhicitta is that what destroys the hardness or the rigidity of self-cherishing and brings true freedom from suffering and ignorance. And wisdom is that what brings true freedom from suffering and ignorance. And therefore, Lojong teachings are the basis of training in both of these. Nagarjuna's this quote then also establishes the sort of the view and the basis of the Lojong teachings, which introduces one to relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta. Compassion that touches everything and everyone is then relative bodhicitta. And the wisdom that is able to go beyond stain of duality, ignorance and duality, is the pointing out of the absolute bodhicitta. So bodhicitta can be, and as many of you have heard, is about relative bodhicitta, which is on compassion, and absolute bodhicitta, which is the cultivation of the wisdom quality. Union of both wisdom and compassion, or the union, non-separation of relative and absolute bodhicitta, is then called enlightened heart, or the enlightened true nature of one's own mind. So the Lojong comprises of both of these two, introduces you to both of these two concepts of absolute and relative bodhicitta. So this then is given under the heading of the third classification. Now the third classification is the actual instructions and the additional, supplementary. So the third division of the actual teachings of Lojong also can be divided into subdivisions of actual explanation and additional explanation. First is the actual explanation, which then introduces us to the 7 chapters, or also called 7 points of mind training. So as I said this morning, Lojong is the title. It has 7 main points of mind training. The first is, and within which there are the 59 slogans. So just to give you the layout of the chapters or the points and the slogans, the first point of mind training is called instructions on what supports the Dharma. That's the first point. It is also easily called the first point of the ground or the foundation teachings. Within this first point, there is the first slogan. Of the 59, the first slogan belongs to the first point. Instructions on what supports the Dharma, introducing the ground or the foundation. Second point is called actual practice of training in bodhicitta. Actual practice of training in bodhicitta, the second point, comprises of 9 slogans. The second to the 10th slogan belongs to the second point. Then the third point is transforming adversities into the path of awakening. Transforming adversities or challenges into the path of awakening. Within this third point, there are 6 slogans. Slogan 11th to the 16th belong to the third point. Then the fourth, Then the fourth point is showing the utilization showing the utilization of practice in one's whole life. And this comprises of 2 slogans, the 17th and the 18th. The 5th point is called Evaluation of Mind Training, and that comprises of 4 slogans, the 19th to the 22nd. The 6th point is called Disciplines of Mind Training, and this contains 16 slogans. The 23rd to the 38th slogan is in the 6th point. And the last, the 7th point of mind training, called Guidelines of Mind Training, comprises of 21 slogans. 39th to the 59th slogan belongs to the 7th point of mind training. So that's how the text, the actual training, is divided in learning how to cultivate the 7 points through the instructions called the 59 slogans, of which then the first point is instructions on what supports the ground, the foundation of the teachings, which consists of the first slogan, train in the preliminaries. Now, preliminaries usually are referred to as contemplating on the 4 outer preliminaries. Ngondro, many of you are familiar with. So Ngondro, or the preliminaries in the Vajrayana foundational practices, comprises of the 4 outer preliminaries and then the 4 inner preliminaries. 4 inner preliminaries are, some of you do the practices of refuge and bodhichitta, forms the first one. Vajrasattva is the second one. Offering of mandala is the third practice, and Guru Yoga is the 4th practice. In some traditions, refuge and bodhichitta combines prostrations together. In some traditions, very specifically, prostration is added to the Guru Yoga section. This depends upon how the teachers teach, and that's how one practices. In Lojong, because this is a Mahayana text, preliminaries are referring to the outer preliminaries, not the inner preliminaries as we just mentioned. Outer preliminaries comprises of contemplation. It's more contemplative in nature. And as they are called, it is Londok Namji is the Tibetan word, and Londok means to transform one's own mind. And these are truly Londok practices. The contemplation of these 4 points, preciousness of human birth is the first. Second is contemplating on the second thought, which is the impermanence. The third is contemplating on karma, cause and effect. And the 4th is contemplating on the sufferings of sentient beings of the 6 realms. So these 4 contemplations are called 4 thoughts that transform the mind, and aptly referred to it so. I've often said one of the weakest links to a Western practitioner's connection to the path of the practice, often I find, is due to the carelessness of not contemplating on the 4 thoughts very strongly enough. They are sometimes called the 4 reminders, and they are otherwise translated correctly as the 4 thoughts that transform the mind. Later on in your practice path, and not only later on, but maybe it's happening even now, when you meditate and you have different questions. Why did I become a Buddhist? Might be one of this. Why did I commit myself to the practice? When you are in practice or meditation, this is not making any sense. And particularly the very popular thing that you all go through, maybe not here, but I've often found, is when you sometimes have doubt and hesitation and you think it doesn't make sense, and why am I visualizing this, or I don't feel connected to the practice, or this is very overwhelming to me, or I should have never taken that vow or precept or commitment, and so forth. And then when challenges happen in your life as well, and you have these different kinds of thoughts that tend to bring about vacillation from the commitment and the connection to the path of practices, then you run around asking teachers questions and trying to gain inspiration to focus and come back to the path of the practice, which I feel is actually not necessary, because the answers are in the 4 reminders, in these 4 thoughts. Why are you doing this? Why are you a Buddhist in the first place? Or why did you choose to be on this path of the practice? And then you have to simply say, because you are the holder of the precious human birth. Your life as a human being is endowed with so many wonderful capacities and qualities that who else would then otherwise not recognize the responsibility of this human heart and this human mind and the capacity of goodness that it holds, that can be the basis of happiness for yourself and for the others. In the same way, why am I in retreat? Why do I have to do 100,000 of this? Why do I have to prostrate? Why do I have to sit in meditation? This posture does not, is not something that I feel connected to. When those questions come up, answer is very simple. You have to do it because there is impermanence. It's in a short period of time that you have to refine and hone out all the qualities that are there within your mind. In the same way, answer questions and doubts, hesitations when it comes about, then thinking about karma. Because of karma, you take vows. Because of karma, you develop ethics. Because of karma, you develop awareness. Because of karma, you have to then transform and transcend your physical body, speech, and mind in accordance with the view of the Dharma. And why not? Because suffering is there. Nobody wants suffering. Everyone wants happiness. And yet they are not able to really generate that awareness that can remove the suffering, unwanted suffering, and in its stead bring about happiness for yourself and the others, reflecting upon the suffering of sentient being and one's own sufferings. And therefore, that is the reason why you are a Buddhist. That is the reason why you sit on the cushion. That is the reason why you then take teachings and instructions and practice and work with your own mind. So all of those questions, because are answered by the 4 thoughts, it is these 4 reminders that really help you transform a lazy mind to an awakened mind, an ignorant mind to a wisdom mind, a mind that is self-absorbed to a mind that is awakened to its own natural nature. And because this is the very foundation, until the mind really awakens to its own capacity through reflections on the 4 reminders, any subsequent practices that you may try to do before thinking carefully of the 4 reminders will inevitably lead you to, again, having setbacks. Because the doubt, hesitation is the potent power that the ego is going to use when it feels the threat of your trying to transcend it, transform the ego itself. Because of this, the first slogan is to train in preliminaries. These 4 traditionally, as I said, are the 4 reminders. Normally, I tend to use a slightly different terminology, just so that people get a much more simpler understanding of what the 4 reminders are. So therefore, if you look at the teachings of Karmapa Wangchuk Dorje in his teachings, he has this very unique way of presenting within the context of meditation, path of meditation. In the illuminating the darkness of ignorance, he uses these 4 terms, which I find very, very helpful, especially for the Western mind to work with. And therefore, he refers to impermanence, and his way of making the order of the 4 reminders is also slightly different in the illuminating the darkness of ignorance. He puts impermanence first, and therefore the first reminder, impermanence, he refers to it as knowing that at the ultimate there is nothing to hold and to contemplate on that. Impermanence is just that. In the absolute, there is nothing to hold. What is there that you can hold on to? As a child, I used to have a storybook in which there was the story. Nowadays, I forget which king it was, but it was some very powerful emperor whose dying wish was to have him, as the coffin was taken on a procession towards the cremation ground, he wanted 2 holes made into the coffin so that his 2 hands could be coming out from the holes for the people to see. And it is said that his ministers and family members were very surprised to hear this, and they asked the king, why would you like your body to be taken out in a procession with your 2 hands hanging out of the coffin? And he is said to have told them, so that people can see that the emperor also leaves empty-handed. And that I thought, so wonderful way of saying, that's how it is. All that what we acquire, all that what we think is permanent, all that what we think is unchanging, eventually what our ego allows us to believe to being permanent and lasting and unchanging. Ultimately, if you really give it a good thought and contemplate, what is there that we can hold on to? We can't even hold on to our own thoughts, our own minds, our own memories. We can't hold on to anything, and foolishly allowing the ego to pretend as if everything can be held. Much of every negative action comes from this foolish thought, foolish idea. So therefore, remembering and recollecting as a meditator prior to walking on the path that transforms a sensitive mind to a compassionate mind, to journey into developing bodhichitta, don't be in a hurry. This is then the key point. To be in a hurry to be kind usually gets you into trouble, because then the initial romantic period, really weakens up very, very quickly. So prior to doing anything that even broaches on benefiting others, first work with the foundation that really knows there is nothing to hold, absolutely nothing to hold. Form, there is nothing to hold. Speech, there is nothing to hold. Mind, ideas, feelings, perceptions, and thoughts, they are also grabbing them is like grabbing a wisp of smoke, and that you think you've held on to something. But if you open your palms and you look, there's nothing other than some sense of having held on to something, tangibly, realistically, nothing to hold. Therefore, in the ultimate, there is nothing to hold. And thinking and keeping that in mind is working with the first reminder, nothing to hold. Not only is there nothing to hold, but also recognize the second reminder, which is recognizing struggle. Now, a lot of times people say, what is karma? And we Buddhists usually say karma is cause and effect. If you do this, you get that. There's a seed, there's a fruit. The fruit becomes more causes and seed for other. That's one way to explain. But karma more simply can be understood as struggle. It's just struggle. Karma is just struggle. Now, every day I say as meditators, when you go to sleep and you feel exhausted and tired, and physically you feel tired, mentally you feel tired, and when you say things like, I'm exhausted and I'm very, very tired, as a practitioner, give a good reflection at that time. What are you tired? Why are you tired? Why are you exhausted? Why are you physically feeling all the aches and the pains? And the answer will be simple. You're tired because you've been struggling. Now, what were you struggling with? And if it was a fantastic struggle, then you still have reason to gloat over the fact that you are tired because of this struggle. Buddhistically speaking, you've been struggling and you feel exhausted, but you've been struggling with 3 things, only 3 things. Trying to make everything impermanent permanent, all right? Trying to make whatever is interdependent independent, and trying to solidify everything that is essentially empty in nature. You're struggling, basically doing these 3 things the whole of your life. I always say, every gray hair or no hair, every wrinkle, every pain inside and out, all of these, you can say, is the result of just these 3 struggles. And the more you feel, the more you have struggled with it. And you are trying to struggle with something that is against the nature, against the law of nature. Everything is impermanent. but each one of us, every day struggle and think it may be an exception for me. Something will stay stable for me. And it doesn't. People change, things change, life changes, everything changes. But you're trying to make it firm, you're trying to make it permanent. Of course you're very exhausted because you're trying to do this impossible thing and you don't give up. It's not one day, it's not 1 month, it's not one lifetime. You keep doing this consistently. Then everything is interdependent. Everything is dependent upon many different things coming together. We don't see it that way. We think everything is independent. I see it, and therefore this is how it is, and not seeing the interdependent nature of everything. We are very quick with praising. We give credit to one thing. We are very quick with blaming. We blame one single thing. Not understanding the complex nature of dependent origination, we continually believe everything is one. Everything is independently one. Things don't remain that way. Since it is interdependent, something or the other doesn't work, and one aspect or one facet of everything doesn't come together, that again makes us struggle. And that's the struggle we keep with our life. Not only is that essentially everything is empty in nature. If we examine beyond mentally thinking it being there, what is the reality of any phenomena? What is the reality of even my ideas, my thoughts, my mind, my feelings, my perception? Essentially empty in nature, because if you go to really look at what is independent, what is really there, that is solid, unchanging, real, we can't find anything. I'm not going to elaborate because most of you have received teachings on this. And so knowing it to being essentially empty, yet we allow ourselves to think everything is solid. My idea is solid, my hope is solid, my fear is solid, my unhappiness is solid, my suffering is solid. This feeling is not going to change, or should not change. You should not change, the weather should not change, the world should not change, whoever is wherever should not change, they should remain as it is. And our greatest preoccupation is to complain, it changes. It's not the same. There's that struggle. Karma is just this struggle to trying to make everything impermanent permanent, everything interdependent independent, everything that is empty in nature to being more solid, and we go to sleep tired, exhausted, frustrated, depressed, disappointed. It's not working. They're not listening to me. Things are not permanent. Things are keeping on changing. Things are doing, and that boils the mind, so to speak. And the anger, the frustration, the attachment, the grasping, the jealousy, arrogance, everything is the byproduct, basically rooted in these three, really ignorant expectations. Karma is just getting this, into this stream of this expectation, this unnecessary ignorant expectation. Now not only do we do that, but we have our own ego, and the ego tends to not only be stupid enough in the struggle, but it has to then be egoistic. So in its egoisticness, I don't know whether there's a word such as that, egoism, what happens is it begins to justify. Yes, everything is impermanent, but I would like it to be permanent because, and then we justify why we have to do it. I know everything is empty in nature, but my feeling is more solid because. And then we have other reasoning, and you justify. You justify your anger, you justify your attachment, you justify your jealousy, you justify your ignorance, you justify your own arrogance, you justify by saying strange things like, yes, I know, but, then you keep on going. This is some word in English, if there is an irritating sort of a word for me, I really find these collection of these 3-4 words, and I always tease and scold the ones who live with me because they always do this. I know but. That's the famous word. Whenever you say, why are you doing this? Don't do it this way. I know but. So then I always find this very, very irritating. So I know but. That if you know, don't do it. Isn't it? It's as simple as that. But we have this justification. Struggle is called karma. Justification of that struggle is called suffering. Karma Bhagwan Doji in his teachings very beautifully presented in this way. So he says, karma is just the unnecessary struggle you put. Then there is the justification of that struggle. I know I shouldn't be angry, but. I know I shouldn't be jealous, but. I know this is empty in nature, nothing to fixate upon, but. And that's how not only you create a momentum of action, but then because you're justifying it, it begins to get bigger and bigger, and inevitably, what is pain? What is suffering? What is unhappiness? What is fear? Is just this karma that you produce, and then the justification of that karma that you are producing. And that is how samsara is created. Suffering is of all different kinds. And you can contemplate on the suffering of the sentient beings in many different ways, whether it is suffering of birth, old age, sickness and death, whether it is suffering of change, whether it is suffering upon suffering, and especially if you look at the suffering of phenomena, suffering of the composite nature of the phenomena. These are one way to look at what is the reality and the nature of suffering. On the other hand, suffering is knowing what not to do and yet doing it consistently. It's somebody telling you, don't scratch that wound, it'll make it bleed. And you say, I know but. And then the itch is just too seductive in nature, and so you keep sort of scratching on that what is bleeding. That is then called the kind of ignorance that allows us to continually suffer and remain within samsara. So therefore, knowing nothing to hold, recognizing unnecessary struggle, and much worse, seeing the ignorance in which we try to justify this unnecessary struggle, meditators should always treasure and bring fruition to the freedom one has now. Here and now, in this moment, your mind, gifted with this immensely wonderful capacity to become the basis of happiness for yourself and the others. As the teachings, minor teachings say, everyone wants happiness, nobody wants suffering. And it is true. Every movement that our body makes, every sound that our speech makes, every thought that we try to generate is constantly searching for happiness, searching for ways to be free from pain and what one fears the most. And if that is so, if happiness is what we aspire, if freedom from suffering is what we aspire, true awareness and wisdom is in trying to then work with the basis, the mind itself, that is the basis of generating genuine cause of happiness for oneself. And through that, if you can even make it better and stronger, that it can become the basis of happiness for the others, then how could one not really then work with the basis of one's own mind? So therefore, four reminders, or the four thoughts that transform the mind, train in the preliminaries, is to begin to work with this first point and the first slogan, through which then one has the impetus or the direction that one gives to practicing and formulating a strong foundation for the Lojong practices. Then the second point is actual training in the bodhicitta practices itself. Actual training in the bodhicitta begins with the presentation of the absolute bodhicitta practices. In general, in India, where the Mahayana teachings originated, there are two prevalent traditions in which bodhicitta practices, or the practice of generating compassion, is taught. first tradition is where relative bodhicitta is presented first, followed by instructions that then teach the absolute bodhicitta, where students are first taught the instructions on relative first and then followed by absolute, such as the tradition of Shantideva. And if you read and study classical texts like the Bodhisattva Acharya Avtara, you will find this tradition being prevalent. Second tradition is where the absolute bodhicitta is first taught and then followed by the instructions on the relative bodhicitta. If you look at some of the most exhaustive materials and instructions on cultivation of bodhicitta, especially if you look at Longchen Rabjampa's teachings, you will find this second tradition being taught. And Nivaro Muche as well as Longchenpa, and then followed by great masters such as Jigme Lingpa himself, they have often emphasized really introducing absolute bodhicitta first, because that is who you are. And through the confidence of knowing what your true nature is, and then being able to practice engaged bodhicitta or action bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta, as not something that is acquired extrinsically, but as a manifestation, radiance of your own true nature. So this tradition of presenting absolute bodhicitta first, followed by relative, is also the tradition followed in the Lojong teachings. And therefore, in Lojong, you will find that the second point, which comprises of the first few slogans, basically the first 6 slogans that are contained within it, being absolute bodhicitta first, and then the remaining 52 odd slogans are all dedicated to relative bodhicitta. So in the beginning, knowing these 2 traditions, based upon these 2 traditions, there also originated 2 forms of meditation, 2 traditions of formats of training in meditation, known as the Jogum tradition and the Chegum tradition. Jogum is a Tibetan word, today literally translated as resting meditation. Many of you are more familiar with the Sanskrit term shamatha, or what is called the Shine meditation in Tibetan. This is usually called Jogum. Jogum simply can be translated resting. Meditation, Gom, or resting and gaining familiarity in resting. Second tradition of meditation is called Chegum, which you know as Laktung or Vipassana meditation. Chegum can easily be translated, literally be translated as analytical, gaining familiarity with analytical meditation. Now these 2 traditions, the first, Jogum, what you call shamatha or shine meditation, resting meditation, connects and works with co-emergent ignorance. Ignorance is also usually 2 kinds. There's the co-emergent ignorance, which is not knowing one's own true nature. When there is this sense of marikpa, not seeing clearly, not knowing one's own true nature, that's one way of looking at co-emergent ignorance. Shamatha or Shine meditation works with really being able to free oneself from co-emergent ignorance. Chegum, analytical meditation, works with proliferation, works against proliferation of ignorance. And therefore, analytical meditation has much to do with examining what, from the co-emergent ignorance, whatever proliferations of ignorance and the many different branches of ignorance that manifest. Analytical meditation, Vipassana, works in cutting through this kind of the proliferation of the basic ignorance. Now, although it is not necessary, nor is it possible to say this is better or worse than the other. So one can't say shamatha is better than Vipassana, or Vipassana is better than shamatha, or the opposite way. Nevertheless, through many of the teachers' teachings, if one were to really look at the essential meaning of meditation, jogum, shamatha is always considered to be far superior than vipassana meditation. Many times people ask, is it shamatha and then vipassana? Or is it vipassana and then shamatha? Answer is, it's shamatha, vipassana, and then shamatha. Again. But there's a difference between the first shamatha and the second shamatha. Because the first shamatha is usually the preparatory guidelines and the instructions on how to sit, how to train body, speech, and mind to really gain a good foundation of concentration. Based upon finding a good foundation of concentration, then if the mind still remains very distracted and the concentration is still persuaded by one's own habitual graspings and distractions and following of distractions, then analytical meditation is prescribed so that you can cut through and recognize the nature of thoughts and feelings and perceptions or whatever distractions are there. And through cutting and realizing the nature of that, whatever creates a disturbance to your concentration, freeing yourself from the proliferation of the ignorances through the analytical meditation, then one transitions into resting. Resting within that awakened state that is not seduced by the co-emergent ignorance. So the ultimate resultant state of true contemplation or true meditation is said to be jogum or resting meditation. So here the point is to really understand the value and the profoundness of shamatha meditation. But the shamatha has to be, again, resting in the very pure nature and not in the sort of an emotional state. This, when it is not understood, that a lot of people think I am doing meditation. But jokingly, I always say there's a difference between nesting and resting. But it makes it easier for me to try and be clear on what we mean. Nesting is when a hen sits on the egg and warms it. And this is pure speculation, but I think I'm quite correct. But there's a fair degree of excitement, I think, that the hen goes through when the egg becomes ready to hatch. And it's sort of moving, and it knows it's going to hatch. If your shamatha meditation is like this, oh, something's going to happen. You know, the mind is going to be clean or pure, and then my mind is now truly free of any kind of thoughts. There's an ambition. There is some kind of an excitement and an attachment. That is not shamatha meditation. When the shamatha is still within an emotional, your relationship to meditation is still emotional and has an agenda of the self, it is at that time where you have to then progress to vipassana meditation. You have to then analyze and see what is the nature of my expectation, what is the reality and the nature of the mind that thinks there is something to see, something to obtain, something to grasp to. And through the analysis, when you see everything is a projection of my own expectation, even the expectation is just a supposition, it is a speculation from my own mind, it's a mere assumption which has no inherent nature of its own self, and then you let yourself completely be free from an agenda-driven state of resting, where it is much more relaxed within the pristine nature of your own mind. That is then said to be more a meditation of shamatha. So that building of that kind of a shamatha is said to be extraordinarily beneficial, and that's the true meditation. Coming back to just the tradition, introducing you, then there are these two traditions of the resting meditation and the analytical meditation. Analytical meditation works with the proliferation of ignorance. Resting shamatha meditation, shine, works more with the co-emergent meditation. Now, beginning of introducing the second point of actually resting the mind starts with resting meditation, jogum. There is a combination of the two. relative bodhicitta, absolute bodhicitta, resting meditation, analytical meditation. In working with the second point, the main practice, training in the bodhicitta, meditators have to allow the two to then complement one another. Absolute bodhicitta and resting meditation. These two go together. Analytical meditation and the relative bodhicitta then combine together in the later slogans or the essential points. To first work with the second point of truly training in the generation of the bodhicitta heart is resting meditation, jogum combined together with the absolute. Now jogum here, to rest, begins with cultivating the 7 points. Here again, many times when meditators are introduced to Hine or Shamatha meditation, 7 points of meditative posture, which is called the 7 points of Vajravirotana posture, is prescribed. I think most of you already are familiar with these. These 7 points of Vajravirotana is introducing how to cross your legs is one, how to place your hands, whether it is on your knees or whether it is in your lap, with the left and the right palm on one top of the other, and then the two thumbs meeting gently together at the level of your navel, so that it creates a balance of both the sides of your body. That is the second. Then the other is to straighten your shoulder so that the shoulder resembles like an eagle almost taking flight. That's the third one. Keeping your spine erect is the fourth one. Bending your neck slightly so that your chin and the Adam apple sort of slightly meet with one another. That's the fifth point. Sixth point is to then, usually we say the tip of the tongue should touch the palate. That's the sixth. And then the seventh is the gaze. Now gaze can be many different ways. When you are first introduced to meditation, the gaze is said to be let loose, the gaze running over the bridge of your nose to look directly in front of you, about a foot away from where you are sitting. These are called the 7 points of Vajravirotana, which usually is introduced to meditators when they are first given meditation instructions on how you should actually carry your posture. Essentially speaking, in the teachings of Mahayana and Vajrayana, these 7 are also taught not only from a physical points perspective, but also going to the essential meaning of what they mean. So therefore, these 7, as I just went through the enumeration, can be seen in this way, or you could also enumerate them essentially in a slightly different way. In which case, the first point would be establish firm foundation. Second is generate equilibrium. Third is create space. Fourth is awake. Fifth, relax. Sixth, loosen up or loosen. And seventh is called dot in space. The whole point of sitting in a particular posture of meditation is not so much the body. Although if I was speaking about yoga of the body, I could talk a lot about how posture is important. We're here working with training the mind. So I'm going to then shift the essential meaning from body to what it actually means. If you are meditating, you have to let yourself rest in meditation. And that does not mean rest on a cushion. That does not mean you rest better on a chair or on a bed or wherever it is. From an essential meditation perspective, you could be doing a headstand and still have good meditation. You could be on a couch, you could be lying down on your bed, you could still have meditation, so long as you are clear with incorporating these 7 points. First one is firm foundation. Firm foundation is, I am here. Usually I say, the simplest way to say what is firm foundation is here and now. I am here. If that sense of bringing your mind and body, both are not there, then even if you have the most, firm kind of a posture and sitting in all of the postures, that's not meditation so much. That's good posture. Isn't it? So meditation is about mind, bring it here and now without any distraction. Second is create a balance, not too tight, not too loose. Too tight has to do with spiritual ambition. You've been distracted your whole life. Meditators do that. You've been distracted your whole life, and now in half an hour you're going to do everything. Undo everything that you've been doing for your last thousands of lifetimes. That's spiritual ambition. Bring a balance. Yes, what you're doing is important, but don't make it into something bigger. Be practical. Bring a balance. Not too tight, not too loose. In this moment. Third is create space. Space is a lot. Even in posture when you sit, and the shoulder has to, the third point is make space with your shoulder. Allow the shoulder to be slightly sort of higher, and make sure that it is standing straight. Now the posture of the shoulder itself is, it opens up the chest area. It is about you're mentally, mindfully creating space so that there is no linear vision, there is no rigidity in your own meditation. So therefore, here and now, firm foundation, balanced equilibrium, both hands, whichever way it is, but there's a sense of reminding yourself not too tight, not too loose. Create a space within your own mind so that it does not become so self-absorbed in its own self. Within that spaciousness, then bring the fourth point, awake, which is, yes, create a spaciousness, but don't be so lost, as they say, space out, sort of too lost in the vagueness of the spaciousness. Be very spacious and yet remain awake within that spaciousness. There's a sense of always having to bring a balance in your own self. Be awake, but then the fifth point, relax. Even in that awakenedness, don't bring ambition, self's ambition, and therefore slightly relax. Physically relax your neck on the shoulder. Be able to really have a sense of bodily resting and relaxing. That's very important. In that relaxation, loosen. Loosen is very important. Loosen up facial muscles. Loosen up your tensions that you bring to your shoulder, to your back. Especially in meditation, most of our teachers always say, observe your jaws. If the jaws are clenched and tight and the facial muscles are tense, you can be sure that your mind is more tight and rigid, within which clarity and awakenedness can rarely happen. So therefore, loosen all the facial muscles. In many of the teachings, there is always some kind of a emphasis given in bringing a little smile, and that smiling is not only about being benevolently smiling. Smiling is a lot to do with relaxing the facial muscles. And therefore, the perfect example usually is given is the Buddha's statues. That the Buddha's statues, nowadays they make all kinds, but the real traditional one always has a smile that is not quite a grin, but it is a smile, which is said to be not because of some kind of a emotional idea about how kind the Buddha is. It's more to do with that physical smile that relaxes the jaws and the tensions of the face, which is then what also enhances the mind to relax. So therefore, firm foundation, finding balance and equilibrium, create space, be awake but relaxed, loosen up, and then the most important, rest your mind like a dot in space. Now if you look at dot in space is a Dzogchen term usually. Now if I take any pen or any, like this kind of a paper clip, and if I poke the space in front of me, if I mark the space in front of me with a dot, and then I look at it, there is no dot in the space, but it gives me a sense of being focused within an expansiveness. It is about being there, but not localizing that point where you are. Resting meditation is just this, as it says, within here and now, a firm foundation. Bring balance, not too tight, not too loose. Generate spaciousness, be awake, allow yourself to be totally relaxed, loosen up, open your eyes to look directly in front of you, rest like a dot in space. Just rest. Within these 7 instructions, you begin to then you sort of have an introduction to what resting actually means. Physically, verbally, mentally, simply like a dotted space, rest your mind, truly awakened to your own natural nature. Having thus accomplished these 7 points of resting body, speech, and mind, then it says, let oneself then go into generating chegum, or some aspects of the analytical meditation. Within that resting, now bring in a flavor of the vipassana or the analytical meditation. In order to do this, the simple instructions given by many of our great teachers is in this way. So I'll just read out the instructions. Those of you who are writing can write, and then I'll elaborate on that a little bit. First instruction is, now you're resting within the dot in, like a dot in space, rest. And within that resting, first instruction is, let the 5 senses and its experience settle. That's the first instruction. Let the 5 senses and its experiences settle. Second is, let the discriminating mind be. Just be. Let the discriminating mind be. Third instruction is, relax the notion of self being real. Relax the notion of the self being real. Release it into its empty nature. Relax the notion of self being real. Release it into its empty nature. And the fourth instruction is inward facing. Inward facing. Vijnana, it's a Sanskrit word, V-I-J-N-A-N-A, Vijnana. Vijnana to Janana, J-A-N-A-N-A. Vijnana to Janana. Alaya, A-L-A-Y-A. Alaya to Dharmakaya. So the fourth instruction is inward facing. Vijnana to Janana, Alaya to Dharmakaya. So these are the 4 principles. The first one is, let 5 senses and its experience settle. Now from Abhidharma Kosha's perspective, we are talking about Lojong, mind training. You're going to train, that's all very good, but you're going to train something called mind. So you should know what mind is. What is mind? You're all going to train mind. So what is mind? So when that question is asked, of course, clever Buddhists say it is empty in nature. But when it comes to training, it doesn't work when you have to train something that is empty in nature. So it's better to first understand the concept of mind. In Buddhism, mind has many different layers of understanding. First way, let me just give you a few words because this is sort of helpful in many ways. Mind is the English word that comes from the term sem in Tibetan. Sem is written S-E-M if you're writing phonetics, and if you're transliterating, then it is S-E-M-S. Sem is one, okay? Another name for, now in English you have mind for everything, isn't it? That's also one of the problems, I think, is we talk about Thuk, Sem, Yid, Namshe, Sem, Semjung. In English it is translated mind, 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 mind. So a lot is lost in this kind of a translation as well. So let's just go with some words first. Sem is one, which is mind. In English, mind, sem. Second is thuk, T-H-U-G-S. Thuk. In English, mind. If one were to try and sort of translate it, thug is Buddha mind.
Buddha?
Buddha's mind or Buddha mind. Okay? Then the third term is Yid, Y-I-D. Yid. In English, yes, mind. In English, probably more correctly, it could be intellectual mind. Okay? Then we have Semjung, S-E-M and B-Y-U-N-G. Semjung, which would be mental events. And then another word, Namshe. Transliteration, R-N-A-M-S-H-E-S. It's pronounced N-A-M-S-H-E-Y, Namshe. And this is then in English translated as consciousness. Okay, now these are the terms. Now let's go back again to the first word, sem. Sem is characterized according to the philosophical or the Abhidhamma Kosha, to be precise, teachings as Salshing Rigpa. Salshing Rigpa. Sal is clear. Many times translators translate luminosity, which at this time we're not talking about. We're not talking about Dzogchen terminology. We have to come back to the Mahayana teachings. So the term sal is much more clear or clarity. Rigpa is the second word. So mind, sem is said to have these two characteristics, or inseparable, but two ways to describe it is it has salva and rigpa. Salva, clarity. Rigpa is seeing, to see clearly. The capacity that sees clearly as it is, that's sem. This mind often is also called the first mind. It's called the first mind because it's trying to work with the very first awakened state. Here, if I do this, when you see me do this, you look and you say, oh, the first moment which sees, before it has gotten into the commentary, the clearly seeing aspect, that's the first mind, that's the sem. But the sem gets into immediately semjung. We gave you the word semjung, which is mental events. Semjung is mental events. It says, oh, paper, white paper, that paper, this paper. Or, what is it? I don't know what it is. Is it a paper? Can't see, can see. These different kinds of chatters or commentaries are called mental events. This is also called the activity of the Yid, Y-I-D. Yid, the intellectual mind. Sorry?
Yin is one kind of yoga.
Yin is a kind of yoga?
Yes, you have a yang and yin.
Oh, that's the... This is a little bit different. This is the yid as in intellectual mind. Okay?
This is YID.
YID. That is the yin and the yang. That's the YIN. Now, yid here, the intellectual chatter, is second mind onwards, is all under the domain of the intellectual mind. So, semjung yid. In Buddhism, then we say first mind, clear seeing, and then it gets wrapped into intellectual chatter and recognition. And the more it carries the mental events of many intellectual chatter, it begins to then go outwards. It goes from its own nature and becomes embroiled in the commentaries. So here then we see in the mundane world, ordinary world, the more opinions you have, the more clever you're supposed to be. In Buddhism, it's a slightly opposite. It's the more intellectual chatter, the more distracted you are from your own nature. So you move outwards in that sort of activities and the entertainments of intellectual chatter. Now then comes Namshe consciousness. Namshe or consciousness is described. The definition of Namshe is when the subjective mind takes on the appearance of the object it apprehends. When the subjective mind takes on the appearance of the object it apprehends, that's called the activity of the consciousness. So when we say, what is a consciousness? We're talking about when I look at the paper, clearly seeing the paper, I think, oh, it is a paper. It has Lojong written on it. It's red and white and black, and it's written in English and has 2 pages and so on and so forth. It's the activity of the yid. But in the activity of the yid, the subjective mind holds this object and becomes the object for a while. So it becomes the form it holds, it becomes the sound it hears. When you listen to a melody and a nice music and your body sways from left to right, that's the consciousness, apprehending the object of the sound, and it becomes the sound for a moment. So you can frown with things that it holds, you can laugh with the thing it holds, you can cry with the things it holds. You watch a movie and the dinosaur jumps on you, you're sitting on the chair and you duck. I have a nephew who likes dinosaurs, so it is very much what I've been spending time watching is a lot of dinosaur movies. But when a dinosaur pops out and you can physically sort of hide from the dinosaur, you know, for a moment your mind becomes that momentum. And this is called when the subjective mind takes on the appearance of the object it apprehends. This is usually called the movement of consciousness. This consciousness is then further classified as 8 consciousnesses. So in Buddhism, especially according to the Abhidhammakosha teachings, 8 consciousnesses are then given. First 5 consciousnesses are called sense consciousnesses. 6th consciousness is called mental consciousness. 7th consciousness is called afflictive or afflicted consciousness. And the 8th consciousness is called alaya. Also, ground consciousness. Now, if you look at the first 4 points that we went through, which says, let 5 senses and its experiences settle. Here, what it refers to is the first 5 sense consciousnesses, the eyes, nose, mouth, ear, and the body's tactile sensation. These tactile sense consciousness, sound, ear consciousness, mouth consciousness, nose consciousness, eyes consciousnesses are the first 5 sense consciousnesses. First 5 sense consciousnesses can only experience. Now if you say, what is the capacity? What are the 5 sense consciousnesses? From the Buddhist teachings perspective, 5 sense consciousness can only experience. So when you say things like, I'm experiencing good thing or bad thing or whatever it is, you have to know it's the 5 sense consciousness, which are also called the gates, that it is what it is working with. There is always an advantage or a plus point to this consciousness and a debilitating or a lacking that the sense consciousness has. 5 sense consciousnesses' ability is it experiences. What it cannot do is, it cannot do anything but experience. That is its downside. It can experience, and the sort of the negative aspect of it is, it can only experience, it can't do anything else. Especially 5 sense consciousness do not have the capacity to discern and discriminate. It can only experience. Discrimination can and happens and is the ability of the 6th consciousness, mental consciousness. Mental consciousness is what discerns, what discriminates. It can like the experience, it can dislike the experience, or it can have a neutral attitude towards the experiences. So that's the mental consciousness, also called the 6th consciousness. Its ability is it can discriminate, and its disability is that it can only discern one thing in one time. It can only discern one thing at one time. And it makes it worse that the 5 sense consciousness are not sympathetic to the mental consciousness. And when you are busy, and in the West you all like to say, I'm busy, then it means you're being terribly unkind to your mental consciousness. An example that I can give you is, you are sitting right in front of me here, right? What's your name?
Nita.
Nita. To Nita, if I tell Nita I'm going to throw a ball at you, hold, catch. And if I throw it at her, she will catch this, right? And we'll say, well done. Now if I take 2 balls and throw 2 balls at her, not so sure how much she will hold. I can throw 3 balls simultaneously, 4, or I can throw 5 balls in rapid succession, all 5 balls at her. Just imagine, how many balls will she actually get? Most of the time she'll only be ducking from all the balls that is being bombarded to her. This is quite the relationship between 5 sense consciousness's experience and the mental consciousness's ability to discriminate. It is not that the mind, the mental consciousness, is weak in its discrimination. It's very clear and it can discriminate very well. But what happens is, a busy sense consciousnesses and many experiences bombard, so to speak, the mental consciousness with so many experiences that it tries to keep up with its discrimination, but does a very bad job out of it. Eventually, what it can discriminate is only 3 things. Yes, no, I don't know. Usually called liking it, disliking it, or a neutral opinion. Neutral opinion is usually not even knowing what it needs to discriminate. When you like something, attachment. When you dislike something, aggression. And when you don't know, then that's the ignorance. Karma is born there. When you like something and you attach yourself to it, without really clearly knowing what it is, because you're just bombarded by the sense consciousnesses, so many experiences are coming, so you can only say like, dislike, I don't know, yes, no, I don't know, yes, no, I don't know. This is basically the kind of gross discrimination that happens, and therefore mind can discriminate, but it does not discriminate clearly. Because of this reason, meditators are then taught to keep your eyes closed, sit down in a quiet room, don't follow thoughts, be silent, be physically still, is to allow the 5 sense consciousnesses to lessen the rapid movement of the experiences so that the mental consciousness, the 6th, can discriminate things more clearly. Otherwise, there is no reason to put in all the disciplines of meditation. But when you are in solitude, when you don't have many things to see, many things to hear, many things to taste, when you're not following thoughts, when you're really able to create an environment where the experiences of the 5 sense consciousnesses are either not so very awake or very gentle in their speed of arising, mental consciousness has the first moment of taking a breath to look at things more clearly. So when we say things like examine clearly, look at the nature of reality, see what the true reality and the nature of things are, you have to have the ability to calm down the many experiences and distractions of the experiences of the 5 sense consciousnesses. So coming back, 5 sense consciousnesses experience, 6th, mental consciousness can only discriminate one thing at a time, and then the 8th consciousness. 8th consciousness is called the ground consciousness. In Sanskrit, it is also called the alaya. It is also called the very ground of one's own awakeness. Now, alaya, I have not forgotten the 7th. I'm just putting it on the back bench for a while. So, the 8th consciousness is this ground consciousness, and the ground consciousness has 2 aspects: inward facing and outward facing. It can introspect, look in its own self, or it can forget looking into its own self and look outwards. When the ground consciousness looks outward, it is called vijnana, Vijnana. Earlier I gave you this term, vijnana. Vijnana is activity, just movements, usually called movement of the consciousness, or also called mental events, or also called a very active yid. Okay, vijnana. Opposite of that is janana. Janana is inward facing. Janana is the Sanskrit term for wisdom. Now, looking outward, when the ground consciousness, the 8th consciousness, instead of introspection of its own nature, when it looks outward, not only looks outward but is enthralled and entertained by whatever it sees, busy in its discrimination and in its experiences and just interfering with everything that is out there, with every sound, with every form, with every taste, with every discrimination, when there's lots of opinion, lots of judgment, when there's just outward, this is called vijnana. This is called vijnana, it is called distraction, it is called outward movement. Here then when we say your mind is distracted, vijnana is in motion. Your intellectual mind and mental contents are always busy on the outward level. That is usually, can all be collectively grouped as distracted mind, distraction. As opposed to when the alaya looks inward in its own self, in its own nature, that is then the janana, awakened to its own nature, and which can then simply be called wisdom. So the Buddhist language of saying generating wisdom is another way of saying awakened to its own self, awakened to its own nature. That's the janana aspect. Now when the mind from the ground consciousness is not only outward facing outward, looking outward, entertained outward, but it begins to think there is someone looking outside. There is someone who likes it. There is somebody who doesn't like it. There is someone for whom the discrimination makes sense. That's the seventh consciousness. Seventh consciousness is called afflicted consciousness or afflictive consciousness because it is afflicted by the supposition that it is there. Usually called self. Seventh consciousness is the supposition that there is ego, there is a self, there is someone who likes, there is someone who dislikes, there is someone for whom the mental consciousness is discriminating. And so that is just then, it is nicely called afflictive consciousness because it has a misconception about its own self. It's diseased by its own supposition that it exists. Actually, if you look, where is the self? As many of you have heard many teachings, if you look at what is the reality of ego, what is the reality of me, what is me, what is I, who am I? And if you really look for it, it's untraceable. You can't find anything that has even a smallest of the atomic way of an atom that can be proven to exist as an independent ego or an I. And so therefore, seventh consciousness is usually just a misconception. It just holds on to a supposition. Other than a supposition, it isn't even there. So these are the 8 consciousnesses layout, sort of the map of the 8 consciousness. Now what are you doing in meditation? We're talking about Jogum and Chegum. We're talking about Shamatha and Vipassana meditation. Shamatha meditation is, as I said, the 7 points. Here and now, in an equilibrium, with space, with genuine relaxation, being awakened, loosened, and as a dot in space, simply abide. In that state of abiding, first, let the senses be and its experience settle, the 4 points that we went through. Let the 5 senses and its experiences settle. Keeping your eyes closed, being by yourself, for a moment that you are in resting meditation, let your senses just settle. Let the 5 sense consciousnesses and its hunger for experience momentarily settle down, where you do not see, hear, taste, smell, or follow or grasp any of the tactile sensations, letting the first 5 sense consciousnesses settle into its own true nature. Not only that, but let the discriminating mind be. And I always say, 15 minutes of not having an opinion will be fine. Nothing disastrous will happen. The world will manage without your opinions and judgments. At least for that moment, let the discrimination simply be. Not necessary to like, dislike, stamp your approvals and disapprovals. Let the mental consciousness just be without grasping, without constantly putting it into movement. Third instruction, relax the notion of self being real. Release it into its empty nature. And that is then why a little bit of listening to Madhyamika and the teachings on the Prajnaparamita, these are very, very essential. When you read the Heart Sutra and then you know that the ultimate nature, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is nothing other than form, form is nothing other than emptiness. And you begin to actually see form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness, all of the 5 aggregates are essentially empty in nature, that they are not findable. You cannot really see something as lasting and solid and tangible and permanent. And therefore, knowing the self and the notion of I and me also being emptiness, for this duration of meditation, reflecting upon the natural nature of emptiness, relax the notion of self being real by releasing it into emptiness in that moment as well. Then the fourth instruction, instead of outward facing, instead of vijnana in motion, allow the mind to look inward, the jnana aspect. What is the true nature of the mind? And therefore, in English, if we were to say, it would be, let the consciousness be. Give your intellectual mind a break. Free yourself from grasping to mental contents. Try to come back to the original first mind, clear seeing. Just be. Let be. Just stay in that state of clearly being able to see and let be, without an opinion or grasping, without holding on to anything. Sound can be heard, but not following, not grasping, not fixating, not having an opinion about it, not thinking it to being anything in relation to the self, letting sound be. Mind, thoughts, feelings, intellectual movements, recognitions and perceptions, all of them will arise. As my teacher used to say, as long as you're alive, these will happen. And therefore, however, not following them, not grasping to them. At that moment, even if it is not for a large chunk of time, 10 seconds, give yourself an opportunity to have feelings and yet not fixate on them, to hear a sound and not grasp, to have ideas and thoughts but not follow them, to see things but not have attachment to them, to really be able to allow yourself, instead of going outward into the domain of the yid, the intellectual mind, come back into the sen, the original clear awareness, the clear recognition. Stabilizing that is the first step to incorporating resting meditation and analytical meditation. So therefore, here in a simple way, the 7 points that we talked about, incorporating then the 4 instructions, letting 5 senses be, letting 5 senses and its experiences settle, letting the discriminating mind be, relaxing the notion of the self into the nature of emptiness, inward facing, instead of vijnana, looking into its own self and not finding anything within that. If one can rest, that would be then combining both analytical meditation and resting meditation. It would be the combination and the union of shamatha and vipassana, or shine and lakton. Just rest. In simple words is, as Patrul Rinpoche says, don't do anything. Yeah, isn't it? This is one of the most, wonderful teachings that are there, and I keep that in mind always because it helps me a lot in my own practices as well. Is Papa Sambhawa Guru Rinpoche, who taught in Tibet, established Vajrayana teachings, and he stayed there more than 50 years in Tibet, 53 years actually. And he taught throughout those 5 decades of his time in Tibet. He taught continuously, but in his biography especially, it's very, very nice to read. When he's just about to leave, he decides to leave Tibet and says that now you should all, to his main students, he says, I have taught you everything you all need to hear. Now you should all practice on your own. And it's very reminiscent about how we sometimes end up with our teachers as well. Someone like me who's lived with my whole life with my root teacher, and yet it is at that very time when you know that the teacher is about to die, that then you begin to suddenly realize you have to ask a lot of questions, because your complacency is woken up. So in the case of Guru Rinpoche also, it's very interesting, is that there's this biographical incident where Guru Rinpoche rides the horse, and then there's the student who holds the reins of the horse asking him to give some instructions. He finishes a set of instructions, the horse turns, there's another student who stops him, asks us for more instructions. And so there's a series of teachings that Guru Rinpoche gives when he got to the horse, when he rode the horse, when he turned the horse, when the horse walked out the gate, and then on the first turn, and then the second slope, and then the third slope, and so on and so forth. The very final, where the border of Tibet ended, you find Yeshe Tsogyal holding the horse and then asking Guru Rinpoche this one question, which I think many of us do, and she says, you've taught for more than 5 decades. Now, however, if you were to summarize all that what you taught in the last 50 years into a few lines that an ordinary person like me can actually benefit from, and hearing this wisdom word from you, it would encompass all the teachings that you have so kindly bestowed on us. What is it that you would then say? And so, unrealistically, sometimes all of them then say, in a few words, condensing all the meaning, easy to grasp, something to remember that we don't forget easily. And Guru Rinpoche, in his generosity and compassion and wisdom, says to Yeshe Tsogyal, there's a verse there, but basically if I were to shorten it, it says, don't touch, don't grasp, don't fixate, don't modify, don't fabricate, don't do anything. And this verse is the most pith instruction of the Dzogchen teachings, from where all of the many Dzogchen teachings that we have, and it's a very core sort of a precious pith instruction that is there. And all of these teachings come from just this point that we are also talking about, is that meditation and resting true to your own nature is about non-deliberation, non-fabrication, not grasping, especially grasping and deliberation that is brought about by a yid, not the pure mind, but the intellectual mind, the intellectual chattering mind. Now, it wouldn't be so much of a problem if the yid was involved, the intellectual mind was involved, if the intellectual mind could be fresh and unique and original. Problem is, yid is the most predictable one. It doesn't have any new information. Sometimes I think when you see fashions of every year, I'm amazed at this whole concept of black dress. You wouldn't know much about it, no? Women do. Most of you have to have this nice black dress. Now, if you look at it, how many different black dresses? It's the same black fabric, right? Short, long, horizontal, up and down, sometimes this low, sometimes this high, shoulder, no shoulder. It's endless. If you look at fashion and how from a black fabric, every year they can produce something that can make people buy at huge prices. Same black fabric. Why not just keep it a yard of a black fabric, tie it as you like whenever you want, isn't it? But human mind is like that. It's very predictable, but it is cut in a different way. So that we think, oh, my mind thinks of a new idea. It's a fresh mind, new idea. There is no newness at all. There is no freshness at all in the way we think. Everything is very predictable. One of the most powerful, significant slogans in the Lojong teaching is, do not be predictable. Don't be so predictable. And that is very, very important because it is there. I think it's the 30th slogan. And that is what is most poignant, because yid tends to be very predictable, and it goes back to its own predictable ways. You like the same thing, you dislike, your opinions, your judgments, everything is the same. It doesn't reach a fresh attitude and a fresh outlook to things that truly is. It is because of that yid cannot be trusted, and therefore meditators are taught not to stop there but to go deeper into the clear seeing insight, being able to really clearly see things as they are rather than assuming that what the yid predictably sees it colors. And therefore, when you look at a person, you don't bring any freshness to your outlook, which is then, earlier this morning I talked about one of the aspects of self-cherishing being is that you don't give others space and freedom. We talked about passive aggression, remember? Mm-hmm. Passive aggression is not giving space and freedom to the others. Not giving space and freedom to the others is because you always bring the yid's predictable opinion to this person. So you never let the person change. You never let the person to be unique. When you see someone, you think, oh, this is that one. Isn't it? And that is, you immediately box this person into your own predictable opinion, and you color the person with your impression, your perception. That doesn't give any space for the person to evolve or to be original. And that is then it all comes down to being unkind. You don't mean to be unkind, but because your perception colors whatever you see, you're not being unkind, but you're not also allowing freedom for the others to be anything unique and original other than the color that you impose upon whatever it is. So then you will say things like, oh, he's a bad person. You don't mean to be unkind, but you've allowed your own yid, your own mental, intellectual mind's color to immediately cover whatever newness is there with your opinions, with your judgment, with the different kinds of projection that your mind is bringing. There is no kindness in that. There is no generosity in that. There is no giving freedom for the others to be. Racism, for example, how does it evolve? Racism evolves because of a perception. It's a predictable mind that has concluded this is good, that is bad, this is high, this is low, this is useful, this is not useful, this comes from the east, this comes from the west, this is one color, that is of another color, this is of one gender, that is of another gender. So when you see a woman, for example, maybe not in America, I hope, but when you see a woman, for example, you think, oh, that's a woman. You don't see the humanness in that person. You see the womanness in that person. When a man comes in front of me, I might go, oh, it's a man, isn't it? And so that I don't see the humanness in that person. You see a man in that person. This is the predictable mind that is colored by the intellectual mind. So the domain of the intellectual mind being so very strong and trusting this, you never access the first mind, which is the pure, clear seeing, seeing as it is, rather than seeing as you have seen before, and as you have then concluded what it is like. So in order to then cut through this, compassion arises, as it says, compassion arises when you access first the mind, clear mind or the pure mind, and free yourself from all of the habitual patterns of the yid, the mental contents, the intellectual chatter, and the domain which places tremendous importance to how the consciousness works and functions, and which usually is just then more an involvement of the self and its feelings. So therefore it says, let five senses and its experience settle, let the discriminating mind be, relax the notion of self being real, releasing it into the empty nature, train in inward facing so that you allow yourself to be free from the vijnana and look inward to really seeing the base mind, clearly seeing things as they are, not getting into the chatter of the intellectualization that is again predictable and is just within the domain of habitual patterns. This is then said to being, here in the words of Drikung Dharma Surya Center, he says, not to take the objective universe as an object of examination, but to take the subjective mind as the basis of resting. Meditation, clearly meditating from the bodhichitta perspective, is to not to take the objective phenomena or the objective universe as an object of examination, but to look inward, the vijnana to jnana, to take the subjective mind as the basis of resting. When you rest within the clear mind. Now the first mind, we talked about sem, clearly seen. When you reach that very first mind and free yourself from the habitual impulse of getting into the movements of the yid, mental contents, mental events, the consciousnesses, experience and discrimination, you free yourself from the habitual pull and the impulses of all these outward movement to go right back to the first mind, clearly resting in its own nature. If you're able to stay there, that's the first step. Not only stay there, but if you're able to keep it unbroken in its continuity, then you progress to developing the Buddha mind, the Tuk. The Buddha's awareness, the Buddha's awakened mind is an unbroken continuum of that pure mind. Here we are just glimpsing it. We are not really able to develop the Tuk. Our mind is still the ordinary mind. And the difference between a sentient being's mind and a Buddha mind is just that, is that the Buddha mind sees clearly and stays with it. We often are not able to see clearly, but even if we are, then we get very choppy, it gets very interrupted, and that's the sentient being's mind. Now if you look at the slogans, and the reason why I went through that is the slogans second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. These 5 slogans in this are all that what we spoke about here. When it says, regard all dharmas as dreams. Although experiences may seem solid, they are passing memories, as the handout says. In the slogans, it just says, regard all dharmas as dreams. And that's the first. It's not just about saying nothing exists, that everything is like a dream. What it is asking is meditators to remain within the pure mind, within the basic nature of mind that sees clearly and is free from all the grasping and the tendencies of different intellectual chatter. And so here Buddha himself says, you think, therefore it is. Patrul Rinpoche then further elaborates on this and says, see the power of your mind. You think it is good, that's what colors it good. You think it is bad, that is what colors the perception as being bad. Look at all the domain, look at the domain of all the intellectual mind that keeps busy in projecting ideas and different thoughts that flavors and shades and gives color to all of the different perceptions. It is all your mind. Your mind thinks, therefore it is. Your mind thinks good, that is what makes it good. Your mind thinks bad, that is what makes it bad. In reality, what is true nature beyond your mind's supposition of what it is projecting? And you find that everything is nothing other than quite similar to a dream. You sleep and you have a dream, you wake up and you think, oh, that was just my mind dreaming. It wasn't real. Likewise, mind at this moment, in its domain of outward movement, it sees, it hears, it has ideas, this is good, this is nice, this is bad, this is mine, this is theirs. Everything is colored and brought about by this intellectual mind's proliferation and constantly going outwards. This is then the proliferating ignorance, not seeing its own nature. It moves outwards and it creates this delusion of a world outside. So regarding all phenomena, regarding everything, regarding all dharmas or all phenomena as dreams, what is reality other than my mind's experience? Experience is your own mind's experience. What is the reality of dream? What is the reality of discrimination? It's your mind's discrimination. You think, therefore it is, as the Buddha says. You think it is so, and therefore you give reality to it. Other than your own mind projecting it, what is the reality of anything that arises? What is the reality of anything that you experience that is not like a dream? Thinking in this way, everything is mind, mind is intrinsic, Mind is in all of these many different levels. Therefore, letting the experience settle, letting the discriminating settle, freeing yourself from grasping to the self that is empty in nature, discovering the very basic mind instead of looking outward, remaining quietly, silently within its own nature. That is then simply the second and the third slogan, which says, regard all dharmas as dreams and examine the nature of unborn awareness. It is called unborn because the awareness is given two facets, first mind and second mind. As I said, the first mind is the clearly seeing, the first mind. That's the unborn, before it is born into an intellectual mind. And so second mind onwards are all the yid, or the discriminating intellectual chatters, and therefore examining the nature of the very first mind, Salshing Rigpa, clearly seeing, simply remain there without allowing the proliferation of all the mental chatters to create about disturbance or distractions and so forth. Fourth slogan says, self-liberate, even the antidote. Antidote, fourth slogan, is about completely emphasizing jogum, shamatha, or resting meditation. Self-liberate, even the antidote. Do not even pretend to meditate. What is meditation? If you're sitting quietly in meditation, but if your mind is always in the domain of the vijnana, outside, feelings, emotions, forms, sound, and so on and so forth, then, bodily you may be on the cushion, but again, as I said, it is more nesting. There is no resting at all. So therefore, here, self-liberate, even feelings, emotions, all of the different kinds of ideas about meditation. I am having a good meditation. That's experience. I'm having a terrible meditation. That's experience. It's the domain of experience. It's the domain of discriminating mind. I am having good meditation has experience and attachment. It has discrimination. It has ego grasping and self grasping. It has all of the consciousnesses actively at work over here. So therefore the fourth slogan is self-liberate. You're not meditating to have a good experience. You're not meditating to discriminate even more. You're not meditating to cling to the idea of an empty self. You're not meditating to move away from your own basic nature. Quite the opposite. You're meditating so that the experiences can settle. You're meditating so that the mind can be free from discrimination. You're meditating so that you can be free from holding on to this false notion of a self existing and simply resting in its empty nature. You're meditating to simply touch base with your own inner nature and nothing other than that. And therefore, self-liberate all of these antidotes of what you think is good meditation, bad meditation, powerful meditation, Buddhist meditation, non-Buddhist meditation, and so on and so forth. And therefore, do not even pretend to meditate. Free yourself from all kinds of appearances that seemingly look like meditation to really look at just the pristine, pure mind. And so therefore it says in the teachings, rest within the empty nature of the fundamental mind and be free from grasping to even the notion of this moment being special. In Guru Rinpoche's teachings to Yeshe Tsojel, when he says, earlier I said, do not do anything was his last instruction. There is one line before that which I omitted. And Guru Rinpoche says, don't fixate, don't grasp, don't fabricate, don't elaborate, don't even call this moment a Buddha. Ultimately, Buddhists face the biggest challenge where you have to free yourself from even being a Buddhist. Buddhist meditation, Buddhist truth, Buddhist insight, Buddhist awakening, becoming a Buddha. All of these then become just trappings for the ego. As I said earlier, it shifts gear. It can't be mundane, so it's going to be nirvanic. It can't survive in samsara, it's going to then change gears and come into nirvana. meditators have to really be very clear about this distortion and manipulation of the ego mind. And therefore here, self-liberate, even the antidote, is very important to keep in mind. It cannot be explained better than by just saying, be natural. In that moment, completely free yourself from any particular special or extraordinary. Self-liberate even the thought that this is a special meditation. Absolutely free your mind to awaken just clear nature of its own self, freeing from every deliberation of mental contents, mental events, consciousness, and so on and so forth. So therefore, as the second slogan says, regard all dharmas as dreams. Third slogan says, examine the nature of the unborn awareness, the clear seeing, and in that moment of resting, self-liberate, even the antidote. Don't call this moment a Buddha. Don't call this a Buddhist moment. Don't call this a Buddhist true nature. Simply rest as naturally as possible. And the fifth slogan says, rest within the nature of alaya, rest within the basis of all experiences. Alaya, as I said, has two facets, the outward facing and the inward facing. Here it refers to the nature of alaya, which is the inward facing. And therefore, from the ground consciousness, look into its own nature. There is nothing to see, nothing to pinpoint. Within the spaciousness of the sky-like nature, just rest. This is the basis of all experiences. And if you can, then, as the sixth slogan says, in post-meditation, be a child of illusion. In the Mahamudra teachings, the example of one of the examples of Mahamudra meditation that is given is bringing a small baby. And it's a baby who can just barely sort of sit on its own self. Such a small baby, if brought into a shrine room with all the elaborate shrines and murals and different kinds of objects that are around the shrine, and if you place a baby, a toddler, in the middle, that baby sees everything but has no opinion of such. There is no mind that says, oh, this is the front, that is the back, or I should sit in a particular way, or this is holy, or this is less holy. There is no concept of the pillar being worse than the statue of the Buddha. There is no concept of the statue of the Buddha being better than the pillar. There is also no such thing as, why is he doing this, or why is it this way, or why is white white, why is the red red. There's a sense of seeing, but no opinions about what it sees. It's a sense of being awake, but within the awakenedness, it is free from the cleverness of the intellectual mind. This is called the child of illusion. In post-meditation, can you be like this child? Seeing, but freeing whatever you see. Hearing, but freeing whatever you hear. Smelling, but freeing whatever you smell. Tasting, but freeing whatever you taste. And having feelings and thoughts and emotions, but freeing them from yourself. True compassion is when you're able to see, but you free them from yourself. When you hear, but you free them from yourself. When you think, but you free them from yourself. And what does free them from yourself means is free them from your clever yid that paints them, good or bad. When you hear a sound, could you appreciate sound for just what it is, without saying good sound, bad sound? Ultimately, who designs, who designates what is good or bad? It is the ego mind. When you see something, you say, friends, enemies, them, ours. Who colors it? It is the discriminating mind. It is the mind busy in its own predictable opinions, colored and archived through repetitions of what its likes and dislikes are, that it then imposes, it imputes what you want to see, what you don't want to see, what you want to hear, what you don't want to hear. And that's how mind discriminates sentient beings and the others. As I said this morning, you never wake up every morning planning to be unkind to the others. Nevertheless, you end up because you allow your intellectual mind to perceive whatever you want, whatever you see, whatever you hear, whatever you think, and you never give others the freedom to be. And you project your own mind over them. Unkindness, lack of compassion, is this rigid attitude of a mind that does not give freedom to the others to be. Absolute bodhicitta is not about any action bodhicitta. There is nothing to do. But in nothing to do, there is tremendous kindness in that you truly give others the freedom from your own discrimination, from your own want of what experiences. You truly give freedom to the others to be free from your own ego and ego's perceptions and demands and projections. That is called absolute bodhicitta. Not doing anything particular, but in not doing, being able to really benefit and have kindness for all sentient beings. This is extraordinarily profound. It is extraordinarily difficult to actually do. And therefore, jokingly, this is something I always repeat myself when you say, I liberate all sentient beings, you have to be very literal about it. May I liberate all sentient beings. That aspiration should really be thought about carefully. Because what you're saying is, may I liberate all sentient beings from me. If you can liberate all sentient beings from your ego mind, sentient beings will be much more happier. Generosity is in that. Compassion is in that. Love is in that. Being patient is in that. What is patience? Is when you allow others to be. Not, your mind demanding. The unreasonable, egotistical demands that it makes, we talked about this morning. Truly being able to do that. So therefore, sitting in your shamatha and vipassana meditation, when you allow your mind to go back into its true nature, resting within that, trusting this innate nature, allowing that trust and resting within the innate nature to free yourself from the impulse, the habitual impulse that you feel that you have to discern, you have to discriminate, you have to have opinions, you have to have judgments, you have to tell other people and other beings what to do and what not to do. When you free everyone from that, all projections, from your own mind's domination, that resting within is called generation of absolute bodhicitta. If you learn to cultivate this confidence of your own nature in and around yourself, you will truly then create a very flexible, compassionate environment from which then all sentient beings will generate tremendous help. And this is, I always say, observe. For example, when great teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama or Jetsun Rinpoche is one perfect example, you see them resting in their own innate nature, and therefore the entire environment around them, without doing anything particular, becomes very sane. Everyone generates the confidence of patience and kindness and laughter and naturalness, and you don't see them saying something particular, doing anything particular, but just because their mind rests within that innate nature, it infuses the inspiration to all the environment around themselves. That's the kind of bodhicitta that should be first cultivated, and when you're able to do that, then you can set about helping others in a much more relative way. So the Lojong teachings, therefore, spend the first section of the teachings on absolute bodhicitta, how to discover bodhicitta as not being action, but recognition of your own innate mind, sensing that, recognizing that, working with that, as I said in the morning, introducing yourself to it, gaining familiarity to that, then gaining confidence of it, when this inner mind awakens to the bodhicitta, innate bodhicitta within one's own self, then you become like the sun that can illuminate in the darkness, and everything can become light and truly benefit the others. From that cultivation of the absolute innate bodhicitta, then when you set out to doing goodness to the others, it becomes inexhaustible and much more purer. So that's the second part. Relative bodhicitta is the second chapter, or the third point onwards, and then we can continue with relative bodhicitta in the morning tomorrow. So for today, work with absolute bodhicitta.